Daniel Brooks dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the dusty main street of Harlan's Crossing, Arizona Territory, and pressed his last biscuit wrapped in brown cloth, still warm from morning, into the hands of a tiny boy sitting alone against a broken hitching post. No hesitation, no thinking it through. His stomach had been growling since dawn. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. But the child's lips were cracked white, and his eyes held something no 5-year-old should ever carry: the quiet, exhausted acceptance of someone who had already stopped believing anyone would stop. Before we go any further into Ethan's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop the name of your city in the comments below and tell me where you're watching from today. Because what happens next on this dusty street will either break your heart wide open or show you that there's still goodness in this world. And I promise you, by the time we're through, you'll feel both. Now stay with me. The summer of 1883 came down on Harlan's Crossing like a punishment from God. It had not rained in 31 days. The creek that ran behind the livery stable had shrunk to a muddy trickle. The cottonwood trees along the main road stood perfectly still in the dead air, their leaves gone pale and curled at the edges, as though even the trees had given up arguing with the heat. Dust settled on everything: the storefronts, the wagon wheels, the shoulders of men moving fast with their eyes down, trying to get their business done and get back somewhere cool before the afternoon sun turned the whole territory into a furnace. Nobody was standing still on the main street of Harlan's Crossing that July morning. Nobody except Daniel Brooks and the boy. Daniel had been working the road crew since before sunrise, hauling gravel and swinging a pickaxe on the stretch of trail west of town that the county commissioner had been promising to grade for 2 years. 12 hours of work for 35 cents and the promise of another day's wages if he showed up again tomorrow. His back ached down to the bone. His hands were so calloused they didn't blister anymore, just cracked and bled when the handle twisted wrong. He had one cloth-wrapped biscuit in his coat pocket and a half-full canteen on his belt, and he had been telling himself all morning that he would eat when he got to the shade of the mercantile awning. He almost made it. He was 3 steps past the broken hitching post outside Dunner's Feed and Seed when something made him stop. Not a sound. The boy wasn't making any sound at all. That was the thing that stopped Daniel. The silence of a child who had given up crying, given up calling out, given up expecting the world to notice he existed. Daniel turned around slowly, the way a man does when something tugs at the back of his neck and he can't explain it. And there he was, a small child no more than 5 years old, sitting in the dirt against the post with one leg stretched out in front of him at an angle that wasn't right. An oversized crutch lay beside him in the dust, too long for his little arms. His shirt was too big. His trousers were stiff with dried mud. His lips were cracked and pale, and his dark eyes were moving slowly across the faces of the people walking past him. Not with desperation, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet observation, like a child who had spent enough time being invisible that he had stopped expecting anything different. Nobody was looking at him. A woman in a green dress stepped around him without breaking stride. 2 merchants, arguing about lumber prices, walked by him so close they nearly kicked his crutch. A man on horseback didn't even glance down. Daniel stood there for 10 full seconds. Then he walked back. He crouched down in the dirt in front of the boy, ignoring the heat radiating up from the ground, and looked at him straight on. "Hey there, son," he said quietly. "You all right?" The boy blinked, like the word son was something that needed a moment to travel. "I'm all right," the child said. His voice was very small and very careful, the way children get when they've learned that honesty sometimes makes adults uncomfortable. Daniel looked at the cracked lips, at the way the boy's small chest was working a little harder than it should be in the heat, at the canteen-shaped emptiness of the space around him. No food, no water, nothing. "When did you last eat something?" Daniel asked. The boy was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his twisted leg, then back up. "I'm trying not to be hungry anymore," he whispered. Daniel Brooks had not cried since the night he buried his daughter 6 years prior. He had made himself a promise about that, and he had kept it through things that would have broken lesser men. But something in those 7 words, not "I'm hungry," not "I need help," but I'm trying not to be hungry anymore. Hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a fist. The child had decided the most dignified response to starvation was to simply stop wanting. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the biscuit. He unwrapped it slowly, set it in both of the boy's hands, and watched the child look at it for a moment, as though checking to make sure it was real before taking the smallest, most careful bite imaginable. "Take your time," Daniel said. "Ain't going anywhere." He uncapped his canteen and set it on the ground within easy reach. And then Daniel Brooks sat down in the dirt in the middle of the main street of Harlan's Crossing, Arizona Territory, in the full baking heat of a July afternoon, and he waited. 3 men walked past and looked at him like he'd lost his mind. A woman with a parasol said something sharp to her companion about the kind of people who lounged around public thoroughfares. Daniel didn't move. He just watched the boy eat, slowly, methodically, in the careful way of someone who doesn't know when the next meal is coming and wants to make this one last. "What's your name?" Daniel asked when the boy was about halfway through the biscuit. "Ethan," the boy said. Then, after a pause, with a formality that was heartbreaking in something so small, "Ethan Miller." "I'm Daniel." Ethan looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes. "You work on the road crew," he said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know that?" "Your hands." Ethan said it simply. "My mama said men who work roads have hands that look like that. She used to watch the road crew from where we slept." Daniel kept his voice very even. "Where do you sleep, Ethan?" The boy glanced toward the western end of town, in the direction of the old freeway bridge, the stone trestle the railroad had abandoned 3 years back. "Under the bridge," he said, "but Mama's not there anymore." "Where is she?" Ethan took another careful bite of the biscuit, chewed it slowly, and swallowed. "There were men with badges," he said. "They came in the night and made everybody leave. Mama told me to stay still and not cry, and she would come back." He paused. "That was 4 days ago." 4 days. Daniel didn't let his face change. He had learned long ago that when a child is holding himself together, you don't react in a way that tells him how bad it is. You stay level. You stay present. "So, you've been sitting here," Daniel said. "Different places," Ethan said with a small dignity that was almost worse than crying. "I walked to where the church ladies give out bread on Tuesdays, but I couldn't carry the crutch and the bread at the same time, so I dropped it." He looked at his hands. "I didn't mean to drop it." "I know you didn't. The bread, I mean. I tried to pick it up, but my leg—" He stopped, looked at his twisted leg again with an expression that was too old for his face. "I fell down." "Did anybody help you?" Ethan looked up at him quietly. It was a look that answered the question without words, and it was the look that Daniel would carry for the rest of his life. "Let me get you out of this heat," Daniel said. He stood, dusted off his trousers, and looked around the street until he spotted Mamie Coulthard's small diner on the corner, the one with the blue curtains in the window and the hand-lettered sign that read, "Hot Meals, 10 cents. "You ever been in that place over there?" Ethan shook his head. "It's cool inside. They've got a fan." Daniel picked up the boy's crutch from the dirt and held it out to him. "Think you can make it that far?" Ethan took the crutch and got himself upright with a practiced efficiency that told Daniel he had been doing this alone for a long time. "I can make it," the boy said. They walked slowly together across the street, Daniel shortening his stride to match the boy's careful, halting rhythm. He pushed open the door to Mamie's diner and held it while Ethan went through. Inside, it was dim and cooler, with a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the smell of coffee and cornbread coming from the kitchen. 3 tables were occupied. Mamie herself was behind the counter, a broad-shouldered woman of 60 with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen everything. She looked up when they came in, took in Daniel, then looked at the small boy beside him, and her expression shifted into something careful and attentive. "2," Daniel said. "Whatever's cold to drink first." Mamie set 2 tin cups of cold water on the counter without a word, and watched Ethan drink his down in long, steady swallows. Then she refilled it. "Sit anywhere," she said, and the warmth in her voice was directed specifically at the child. They took a table by the window, and Daniel ordered cornbread and beans for Ethan and a coffee for himself, because the coffee was cheaper than the cornbread, and he'd already given away the last of his food money for the day. He sat across from the boy and watched him eat properly now, slower even than before, like the safety of being inside had given him permission to take his time. "Ethan," Daniel said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth, because I'm going to try to help you, all right?" The boy nodded. "Is there anybody else? Anybody looking after you while your mama's gone? Family, or a neighbor, or anybody from the church?" Ethan thought about it seriously. "Uncle Richard," he said finally. "But Uncle Richard lives far away. Mama said Seattle is very far." "You have an uncle in Seattle? He's rich," Ethan said matter-of-factly, the way children state things. "Mama said he has a big house and went to a real school. She said we couldn't go there because Uncle Richard and her had a falling out." He looked at his cornbread. "I don't know what a falling out is exactly, but I think it means they stopped being kind to each other." "That's about right," Daniel said. "She said he probably doesn't know we needed help." Ethan looked up. "Do you think that's true? That people sometimes don't know somebody needs help?" Daniel thought about all the people who had walked past this child in the past 4 days. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I reckon that's true sometimes." Ethan seemed to accept this. He went back to eating. Mamie came by to refill Daniel's coffee, and she leaned down slightly and said low enough that only he could hear, "You figure out what's happening with that boy?" "Working on it," Daniel said. She looked at Ethan for a moment, then back at Daniel. "Marshall Hicks comes by around 3. If you need him." "I might." Mamie straightened up and went back to her counter, and the ceiling fan turned slowly, and outside the window, the main street of Harlan's Crossing shimmered in the July heat, while Ethan Miller ate cornbread and beans at a clean table for the first time in 4 days, with a stranger sitting across from him who had given up his lunch and pulled up a chair and refused to leave. It was around that time that Ben Pruitt walked in. Ben Pruitt was not a bad man exactly. He was the kind of man who believed himself to be a good one, which was sometimes more dangerous. He owned the dry goods store 2 doors down, served on the town council, and had a habit of inserting himself into situations he decided were his business. He spotted Daniel and the boy from across the room, took in the crutch leaning against the table, took in Daniel's road crew clothes, and walked over with his thumbs in his vest pockets. "That boy one of the camp kids?" Pruitt said, without bothering to lower his voice. Daniel looked up at him calmly. "His mother's one of those drifters they cleared out from the trestle bridge," Pruitt said. He was looking at Ethan now in a way that made Daniel's jaw tighten. "Boy, where's your mama?" Ethan looked at him steadily. "I don't know, sir." "Well, he can't just sit in here," Pruitt said, turning back to Daniel. "Mamie runs a business." "Mamie invited us to sit," Daniel said, "so I reckon that's between me and Mamie. It's a public concern when vagrant children are wandering." "He's not wandering." Daniel's voice stayed level, but there was something in it that made Pruitt stop. "He's sitting, he's eating, and I'm with him. So whatever concern you have is settled." Pruitt looked at him for a moment, then at the boy, then back at Daniel. Something in Daniel's eyes must have communicated that this was not a negotiation, because Pruitt made a sound in his throat and walked back to the counter to order his coffee, standing there with his back to them. Ethan watched the whole exchange without making a sound. When Pruitt had gone, he looked at Daniel. "People do that a lot," the boy said quietly. "Talk about me like I'm not sitting right there." "I noticed," Daniel said. "Does it bother you when people do that?" Daniel looked at him. "When they do it to you?" "Yeah, Ethan, it bothers me." The boy seemed to consider this answer with great seriousness. Then he went back to his cornbread. Marshall Eli Hicks arrived at 3:15, just like Mamie had said. He was a lean man with a drooping gray mustache and boots that needed new heels, and he listened to Daniel's account of the situation without interrupting, watching Ethan with the quiet attention of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that the real tragedy was usually sitting right in front of you. "Margaret Miller," Hicks said slowly when Daniel told him the mother's name. "Callie's the one who brought them in from the sweep, I think. Let me check the ledger." He looked at Ethan. "Son, were you with your mama under the trestle bridge on the night of the 12th? "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "She all right? Before they moved her on?" Ethan nodded. "She kissed my head. She said she'd be right back." Hicks stood up straighter and exchanged a glance with Daniel over the boy's head. "I'll send a wire to the county," he said quietly. "See if she turned up at the hospital in Tucson or the women's shelter in Benson. Might take a day or two to hear back." He paused. "In the meantime, the boy needs to be somewhere." "He stays with me," Daniel said. Hicks looked at him. "You sure about that?" "Until we find his mother or figure something else out." Daniel kept his eyes level. "He needs somewhere safe. I've got a room over Carver's stable. It ain't much, but it's clean and it's mine." Hicks was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Daniel. He was doing the kind of calculation that honest men do, weighing what the rules said against what the situation actually required. Finally, he pulled his mustache once and nodded. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "We'll see what the county says. You keep him fed and you keep him out of trouble, and we'll figure the rest out." "Yes, sir," Daniel said. Hicks put his hat back on and walked out. Mamie watched him go, then looked at Daniel, and there was something in her expression, a quiet, measuring respect that she didn't put into words. Ethan had been listening to all of it. Now he looked at Daniel with those dark, careful eyes. "You don't have to do that," the boy said. "I know," Daniel said. "You don't even know me." "No," Daniel agreed. "But I know you haven't eaten in 4 days, and I know your mama is missing, and I know that's too much for one small person to carry by himself." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table. "Where I come from, Ethan, that's enough reason." Ethan was quiet for a long time. The ceiling fan turned. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the dirt street, and somebody called out to somebody else, and the ordinary afternoon went on. Then the boy said very quietly, "My leg doesn't work right, in case you didn't notice." "I noticed. Some places won't take children with—" He stopped, tried again. "Some places say it's too much trouble." Daniel looked at him steadily. "My place isn't some places." Another long pause. Ethan looked down at his hands, then up. "My mama is going to come back," he said. It was said with the fierce, practiced conviction of a child who has repeated this to himself in the dark many times against the weight of doubt. "I believe she is," Daniel said, and he meant it. "But until she does—" Ethan started, and then his voice did something it hadn't done once in the whole afternoon. It cracked, just slightly, just at the edge, like a small sound escaping before he could close it off. He pressed his lips together hard. Daniel didn't make a sound, didn't move toward him, just waited. That was something people would come to understand about Daniel Brooks in the weeks and months that followed. He never pushed, he never crowded, he just stayed. He made himself a steady, patient, unmoving presence, and let people come to him when they were ready. And he waited as long as it took. Ethan swallowed, lifted his chin, got control of himself with a dignity that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "Until she does," the boy said carefully. "Could I stay with you?" "Yes," Daniel said. "You can stay with me." They walked out of Mamie's diner together when the sun had dropped low enough to cut the heat by a few degrees, Ethan's crutch working steadily on the wooden boardwalk, Daniel matching his pace without comment. They passed Ben Pruitt's dry goods store. They passed 3 women in bonnets who stared. They passed a group of men outside the saloon who went quiet and watchful as Daniel walked by with the crippled boy at his side. Daniel didn't look at any of them. He looked straight ahead. And Ethan, walking beside him for the first time in 4 days, without being alone, glanced once at the man's face to confirm what he'd already decided. And then he looked straight ahead, too. The room above Carver's stable had 1 window, 2 cots, and a wash basin, and it smelled like hay and saddle oil, and it was the safest place Ethan Miller had been in longer than he could remember. Daniel lit the lamp, pulled the second cot into the corner, and shook out the extra blanket he kept rolled at the foot of his own bed. "Wash your hands and face first," he said, "then sleep." Ethan did as he was told, slowly and carefully, like someone learning what instructions that weren't cruel felt like. He lowered himself onto the cot, arranged his bad leg, and lay back. Daniel sat on the edge of his own cot with his boots still on, elbows on his knees, listening to the sound of the stable below and the night wind starting up outside. "Daniel," Ethan said from the darkness. "Yeah, how come you didn't just keep walking?" Daniel thought about it for a moment, thought about the 12 hours of work, and the 35 cents, and the 1 biscuit, and the specific quality of silence that had made him turn around. Because you weren't asking for anything, he said finally. Everybody who's asking for something, people can walk past that. Tell themselves somebody else will handle it. But you weren't asking. You were just sitting there trying to get through the day by yourself. And you were 5 years old. And that wasn't right. Silence from the other cot. Is that why? Ethan asked. That's why, Daniel said. Another long silence. Then, so quietly Daniel almost didn't hear it. Nobody ever sat down with me before. In the street, I mean. Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the ceiling, at the shadows the lamp threw across the rough beams. They will now, he said at last. Ethan didn't say anything after that. His breathing evened out slowly, the way children's breathing does when the body finally decides it's safe to let go, and within 10 minutes he was asleep. Daniel sat in the half-dark for a long time with his boots on, listening to the boy breathe and to the horses shifting in their stalls below. He thought about his daughter's face. He thought about 35 cents and 1 biscuit. He thought about a child who had decided the most dignified response to being abandoned was to simply stop expecting anything. He thought about all the people who had walked past that broken hitching post. He thought about the specific terrible ease of walking past. And he understood, sitting in the dark above the stable with the sound of a sleeping child filling the room, that he had not saved Ethan Miller today. He had simply been the first person to stop. Everything that came after, all of it, would turn on that single, ordinary act. He just didn't know yet how much. Daniel woke before dawn the next morning, the way he had woken every morning for the past 6 years, with a weight in his chest that took a moment to name. But this time, when his eyes opened, the weight wasn't the familiar ache of guilt. It was something else. Something that took him a full 5 seconds to recognize as the awareness that he was not alone. He turned his head on the thin pillow and looked at the other cot. Ethan was still asleep, curled on his side with his bad leg drawn up at an awkward angle. His face was slack, his mouth slightly open, his small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of a child who had finally exhausted himself into rest. In the gray light filtering through the single window, he looked impossibly small, fragile in a way that the daylight and the crutch and the careful voice had hidden. Daniel sat up slowly, careful not to make the cot creak. He pulled on his boots, stood, and crossed to the wash basin. He splashed cold water on his face, dragged his fingers through his hair, and looked at himself in the small, cracked mirror above the basin. The same face that had been looking back at him for 42 years. But there was something different in the eyes this morning. Something he couldn't quite name and wasn't ready to examine. He built a small fire in the stove at the end of the room, a luxury he rarely used in summer. But the coffee needed boiling, and the boy would need something in his stomach before the day got hot. He measured out the last of his coffee grounds with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly how much he had and exactly how long it needed to last. The sound of the kettle woke Ethan. The boy stirred, blinked, and for a moment his face held that blank disorientation of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. Then his eyes found Daniel at the stove, and something settled in them. Recognition. Safety. "Mornin'," Daniel said without turning around. "Mornin'." Ethan's voice was scratchy with sleep. "There's water in the basin. Wash up while I get this coffee going. Then we'll see about breakfast." Ethan sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes with the backs of his hands, and swung his legs over the edge of the cot. He reached for the crutch where Daniel had leaned it against the wall within easy reach, and got himself upright with that same practiced, uncomplaining efficiency. Daniel watched from the corner of his eye as the boy made his way to the basin, dipped his hands in the cold water, and splashed his face. He dried on the rough towel Daniel had hung on a nail, combed his hair back with his fingers, and turned. "I'm ready," Ethan said. "You're ready for what? Whatever's next." Daniel looked at him for a moment. The boy was standing straight, crutch under his arm, chin lifted, dark eyes clear and steady. He looked like a soldier reporting for duty. "All right," Daniel said. "Next is corn mush. You ever had corn mush?" "No, sir." "It ain't fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." They ate in the quiet of the early morning, the window open to the sounds of the stable coming to life below. Carver's voice low and gruff as he talked to the horses, the stamp of hooves, the creak of leather. Ethan ate slowly, deliberately, but with less of the guarded carefulness of the day before. He was learning, Daniel realized. Learning that the food would not disappear, that there was no need to hoard. When they finished, Daniel rinsed the bowls and set them on the shelf. "I gotta go to work," he said. "The road crew don't wait for nobody. But Mamie said she'd keep an eye on you today. You'll stay at the diner, help her if she needs it. You all right with that?" Ethan nodded. "I can help. I know you can." Daniel walked him to Mamie's, the morning already promising another brutal day of heat, the sun climbing fast over the eastern ridge. The street was quieter now than it would be by mid-morning. A few merchants sweeping their boardwalks, a wagon loaded with feed making its slow way toward the livery. A woman in a faded blue dress looked at them as they passed, her eyes lingering on Ethan's crutch, then on Daniel's face. She didn't say anything, but her look said enough. By the time Daniel reached the road crew, the story had already spread. He knew it would. In a town of 400 people, a man taking in a stray child was not the kind of thing that stayed quiet. He swung his pickaxe in the growing heat and let the work drown out the murmurs he could feel pressing at the edges of the crew. It was Cale Marsh who brought it up first, during the midday break. They sat in the thin shade of a mesquite tree, passing a canteen between them. Cale had been on the crew for 3 years, a big man with a red beard, and no particular malice in him, but a weakness for talk. "Folks are saying you took in that cripple boy from the bridge camp," Cale said. It wasn't accusatory, just curious. "I took him in," Daniel said. "You planning on keeping him?" "I'm planning on making sure he's all right until his mama turns up." Cale chewed on that for a moment. "And if she don't turn up?" Daniel didn't answer. He took a long drink from the canteen and handed it back. "They're saying Pruitt's already talking to the marshal," Cale added, lower now. "Saying it ain't proper for a man like you to have a child in his care. On account of—" He trailed off. "On account of my daughter," Daniel finished flatly. Cale looked uncomfortable. "I ain't saying I believe it. I'm just telling you what's being said." "I appreciate it." The rest of the day passed in the rhythm of pick and shovel, the sun arcing overhead, the sweat running down Daniel's back in steady rivulets. He worked until his shoulders screamed and his hands forgot how to close without pain. And when the foreman finally called it, he walked back to town with the dust of the road thick on his boots and a knot of something uneasy tightening in his gut. Mamie's was quiet when he pushed through the door. The dinner rush was over, and the only customers were 2 old men playing checkers in the corner. Ethan was sitting at the back table with a pencil and a piece of paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up when Daniel came in, and the small relaxation that crossed his face was like water on dry ground. "She's been good as gold all day," Mamie said from behind the counter. "Helped me sort dry beans for an hour, then asked if I had any schoolwork he could do." She nodded toward the back table. "Found an old arithmetic book in the back. He's been at it since 2. Daniel walked over and looked at the page. Ethan had filled half a sheet with numbers, carefully formed, the columns straight. Some of the sums were right, some were wrong. But the effort was there, the fierce concentration of a child who had decided that learning was something he was going to do seriously. "Where'd you learn your numbers?" Daniel asked. "My mama taught me," Ethan said without looking up. "She said if I could do sums, nobody could cheat me." "Your mama was right." Ethan paused, his pencil hovering over the page. "Did Marshal Hicks find out anything?" Daniel had known the question was coming. He had been turning it over in his mind all day, trying to decide how to tell the boy what Hicks had told him that morning before the crew started. He pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down. "He got a wire from Tucson," Daniel said. "They found a woman at the county hospital. Matches your mama's description. She was brought in a few days ago. Heat stroke." He kept his voice level, measured. "She was unconscious when they found her. They didn't know her name." Ethan's hand went still on the pencil. He stared at the page, but he wasn't seeing the numbers anymore. "She alive?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Far as they know." Daniel leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "They're trying to identify her. Hicks says it might be a few more days before they can confirm it's her." Ethan set the pencil down very carefully, parallel to the page. He pressed his lips together. His jaw worked once. Then he looked up and his eyes were bright but dry. "She was trying to come back," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the thing he'd been holding on to for 4 days, finally finding its shape in words. "She was trying to come back," Daniel confirmed. "And she's alive, Ethan. That's what matters right now." The boy nodded once, sharp and precise. He picked up his pencil, looked at the half-finished page, and set it down again. His hands were trembling. "I want to see her," he said. "I know you do. We'll figure out how to get you there when she's well enough." Ethan absorbed this. He sat very still for a long moment, the way he did when he was processing something too large to take in all at once. Then he picked up his pencil again, straightened his page, and went back to his sums with a concentration that was almost fierce. Daniel watched him for a moment, then stood and walked to the counter. Mamie slid a cup of coffee toward him without being asked. "He's got a strong back," she said quietly. "Not physical, I mean. Something in him that don't break." "I know," Daniel said. "You gonna be able to keep him?" Daniel took a long drink of the coffee. It was bitter and strong. "I'm gonna try." The nightmares started that night. Daniel was woken by a sound that cut through his sleep like a blade, a small, choked cry, not loud but desperate. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, crossing the dark room to the other cot. Ethan was sitting bolt upright, his eyes open but not seeing, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His hands were gripping the blanket so hard his knuckles were white. "Ethan." Daniel kept his voice low and even. "You're here. You're in the room. You're safe." The boy didn't respond. His chest was heaving, his whole body trembling. Daniel crouched beside the cot. He didn't touch him. He just stayed close, his voice a steady anchor in the dark. "You're in the room above Carver's stable. Daniel's here. You're safe. Nobody's gonna hurt you." Ethan's eyes moved, focused. He blinked once, twice. His breathing started to slow. "The bridge," he said, his voice cracked and thin. "I keep dreaming. I'm back under the bridge and everybody's gone, and I can't find my mama." "I know." Daniel's voice was gentle. "But you're not under the bridge. You're here. The door's locked. I'm right here. You're safe." Ethan pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. His shoulders shook once, twice. Then he pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms around them, making himself as small as possible. Daniel didn't move. He stayed crouched beside the cot, present and steady, letting the boy feel the weight of his presence without crowding him. "You want me to stay till you fall back asleep?" Daniel asked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm asking if you want me to." Ethan looked at him through the dark. A long, searching look. Then he nodded, just once. Daniel sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say anything else. He just sat there, a silent, solid presence in the darkness. It took nearly half an hour for Ethan's breathing to even out and deepen. Daniel stayed the whole time. When he was sure the boy was truly asleep, he got up quietly and returned to his own cot. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the small, steady breaths from the other side of the room. The nightmares came again the next night, and the night after that. Each time Daniel woke, crossed the room, sat down on the floor, and stayed until the boy's breathing steadied. He never complained. He never made it seem like a burden. He just showed up, night after night, the way he had showed up that first afternoon on the main street. By the fourth night, Ethan started sleeping through until dawn, and something in the boy's face began to change, a loosening around the eyes, a softening at the jaw. The specific physical expression of a body that was finally, slowly, beginning to believe that the emergency was over. The newspaper arrived on the 7th day. It wasn't the Harlan's Crossing Weekly, it was the Tucson paper, the one that went to 3 counties. Someone on the county reporter's desk had gotten hold of Hicks's wire, had talked to somebody at the hospital, had talked to somebody in town, and had put together a story that ran under the headline, "Cripple Boy Found Alone in Extreme Heat, Missing Mother, Uncertain Future." Daniel read it at Mamie's counter with a coffee going cold beside him. His expression didn't change much, but his hand tightened on the paper until the page creased. The story was not cruel. In some ways, that made it worse. It was sympathetic and detailed, and it named Ethan by name. It named Daniel by name, and it described his situation, the road crew wages, the room above the stable, the criminal record that Pruitt had apparently been happy to provide to anyone who asked. It laid everything out with a fairness that nonetheless made everything sound very fragile and very temporary. "It's already on the telegraph lines to Phoenix," Mamie said without being asked. "I know," Daniel said. "And Seattle, probably." He looked at her. "The uncle." She said nothing. She didn't need to. He hadn't thought about the uncle. He should have thought about the uncle. He put the paper down and drank his cold coffee and thought about it now. And none of the thoughts were comfortable. Ethan was at the back table, doing the sums she'd set him. She'd taken it upon herself to give him schoolwork in the mornings, a decision she'd made without discussing it with anyone, as was her way. He looked up when he heard his name and whatever Daniel and Mamie were saying at the counter, but he couldn't make out the words, and he went back to his arithmetic. Richard Miller arrived on the Thursday stage. Daniel was at the stable when he heard the stage come in. He didn't know yet who was on it, and it didn't occur to him that the well-dressed man walking down the main street with a leather valise and the careful, evaluating look of someone taking inventory was walking specifically toward him, until the man stopped in front of Carver's stable and said, "I'm looking for Daniel Brooks." Daniel straightened up from the wheel he was greasing. The man was somewhere around 45, clean-shaved, with the kind of clothes that were expensive without being flashy. The clothes of a man who had money long enough that he'd stopped needing to announce it. His eyes were sharp and dark, and they were Ethan's eyes, Daniel realized with a start. The same shape, the same measuring quality. "I'm Daniel Brooks," he said. Richard Miller looked at him the way men look at each other when they're deciding whether to be civil or direct, and then he apparently chose direct. "I'm Ethan's uncle," he said. "I came as soon as I saw the paper. Where is he?" "He's at the diner down the street," Daniel said. "He's safe. He's been well taken care of." "I'm sure he has." The politeness of it was careful, deliberate, and contained something underneath it that Daniel recognized as the controlled voice of a man who was very angry and was choosing not to show it yet. "You want to see him?" Daniel said. "He's my nephew," Richard said. "My sister's child. Yes, I want to see him." Daniel pulled a rag from his belt and wiped his hands. "Then let's go see him." They walked down the street together without speaking. Daniel was aware of the looks they were getting, the well-dressed stranger from Seattle and the road crew worker side by side, and he kept his eyes forward and his pace even. At the door of the diner he stopped. "Before we go in," he said, "I want to ask you something." Richard looked at him. "Where have you been?" Daniel said. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with the plain, direct curiosity of a man who genuinely wanted to understand. "Your sister and that boy were sleeping under a trestle bridge. She had to run from a marshal sweep in the middle of the night, and she ended up in a hospital bed in Tucson with nobody knowing her name. Where have you been?" Richard Miller's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, something that looked, to Daniel's surprise, a great deal like guilt. "My sister and I had differences," he said carefully. "I imagine you did. People usually do." Daniel's voice stayed level. "But that boy in there survived 4 days alone in July heat on whatever bread he could drag himself to on one bad leg." He paused, one hand on the door. "So I just wanted to make sure we both understood what we're walking into. This ain't about you and me. This is about him." Richard looked at him for a long moment. His expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "Agreed," he said quietly. Daniel pushed the door open. Ethan looked up from his sums. He saw Daniel first, and his face did the small thing it had started doing over the past few days. A quick, involuntary relaxation. The face of someone who had learned that this particular person coming through the door meant safety. Then he saw the man behind Daniel, and his expression changed into something complicated and unreadable. "Ethan," Daniel said, "somebody's here to see you." Richard Miller crossed the room in 4 steps and went down on one knee in front of his nephew. His composed, careful face broke open into something raw and unguarded. "Hey, bud," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. Ethan stared at him. "Uncle Richard," the boy said. It came out flat and careful, with neither warmth nor coldness, just the measured tone of a child deciding what he felt. "I came as soon as I could," Richard said. "As soon as I saw the paper." He stopped, started again. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I'm sorry I didn't know." Ethan looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel, who was standing back near the counter, not interfering, just present. Then Ethan looked back at his uncle. "My mama is in a hospital in Tucson," the boy said. "I know. I'm going there tomorrow. I'm going to make sure she gets everything she needs." Ethan nodded slowly. "She'll want to know I'm all right." "I'll tell her. Tell her I have a room. Tell her I have food every day, and someone sits with me at meals." He paused. "Tell her the room smells like hay, but it's clean. She'll want to know it's clean." Richard Miller's eyes went bright. He pressed his lips together hard. "I'll tell her," he said. "I'll tell her exactly that." Ethan studied him for another moment. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to his sums. It was not a dismissal. It was something more specific than that. It was a child who had learned to receive information carefully and process it privately, who had learned that his feelings were his own and not required to perform on demand for the adults around him. Richard stood up and turned to look at Daniel. His expression had changed again, less guarded, more honest. "He trusts you," he said low enough that only Daniel could hear. "We're getting to know each other." "That's not what I mean." Richard glanced back at the boy. "He checked on you before he answered me. He looked at you first. Do you know how long it takes a child like Ethan to look to someone like that?" Daniel didn't answer. Richard reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He set it on the counter between them. "I have resources," he said, "considerable ones. I can give that boy surgery, schooling, a house in Seattle with a room of his own, doctors who specialize in his condition. I can give him everything." He looked at Daniel steadily. "What can you give him?" The question hung in the air between them, direct and unanswerable, and genuinely meant not as cruelty, but as the honest accounting of a man who believed in practicalities. Daniel looked at the folded paper. He looked at Ethan, bent over his arithmetic at the back table, pencil moving with careful deliberation. He looked at Richard Miller. "Today," he said, "I gave him breakfast and somebody to look at when a stranger came through the door." He picked up his coffee cup. "Yesterday, I gave him the same thing. Day before that, the same." He set the cup down. "I reckon tomorrow I'll give him that too." Richard Miller looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "There's going to be a hearing. The county is already involved. My lawyers will be there. This isn't going to be simple." "I don't expect it will be." Richard picked up his valise. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Ethan one more time, small and straight-backed, working his sums with fierce concentration. Something in the man's face changed, just briefly, into something that looked almost like recognition. Then he walked out. Mamie came out of the kitchen, untying her apron strings with the air of a woman who had heard every word and was choosing not to comment on most of it. She stood beside Daniel and looked at the door Richard Miller had just walked out of. "Lawyers," she said. "Lawyers," Daniel confirmed. "You got one of those?" Daniel looked at her. "Didn't think so," she said. She reached under the counter and pulled out a piece of paper and slid it across to him. "Tom Reardon. He handles cases out of Tucson. He owes me a very large favor from a very old debt, and I called it in this morning." She met Daniel's eyes. "Don't you dare tell me you don't need it." Daniel looked at the paper, then at Mamie, then back at the paper. "You did that this morning, before the stage even came in." "I did it the morning you walked in here with that boy," she said, and turned back toward the kitchen. At the back table, Ethan finished his sums, set his pencil down precisely parallel to the page, and looked up at Daniel. "Is Uncle Richard going to take me to Seattle?" he asked. Daniel walked over and sat down across from him. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at the boy straight on, the same way he had that first afternoon on the sidewalk. "There's going to be a hearing. A judge is going to decide what happens. You'll probably get to say what you want." Ethan absorbed this. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want what's right for you. That's all I've ever wanted." Ethan looked at him with those dark, careful eyes, the same eyes that had been watching people walk past that broken hitching post for 4 days without blinking. The same eyes that had looked at Daniel and, for reasons a 5-year-old couldn't have articulated, but felt with absolute certainty, decided to trust him. "I know what I want," Ethan said quietly. Daniel waited, but Ethan just picked up his pencil, straightened his page, and started on the next sum. Whatever he wanted, he was keeping it for the moment it mattered most. And that moment was coming faster than any of them knew. Tom Reardon turned out to be a small man with a big voice and a suit that had seen better decades. He arrived on the Monday stage with a battered leather satchel, a handshake like a vice, and the immediate unsettling impression that he had already read everything there was to read about Daniel Brooks and was deciding how much of it was survivable. He came straight to Carver's stable without stopping at the hotel first, which told Daniel something about the man's priorities. He found Daniel mucking out a stall, stripped to his undershirt, sweat running down his face in the late afternoon heat, and he stood in the doorway of the stable with his satchel at his feet and watched for a full 30 seconds before speaking. "Tom Reardon," he said. "Mamie sent me." Daniel straightened up, wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, and looked at the man. Small frame, sharp eyes, a nose that had been broken at least once, and the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly what you were walking into. "I figured," Daniel said. "You want to talk in the shade or in the sun?" "Shade would be preferred. I'm not built for this Arizona heat." They sat on overturned buckets behind the stable, where the shadow of the building stretched long in the lowering sun. Reardon took a folded paper from his satchel and set it on his knee without opening it. "Mamie told me the situation," he said, "but I want to hear it from you. Start at the beginning. The day you found the boy." Daniel told him. He started with the morning on the road crew, the 35 cents, the single biscuit. He described the silence that had made him turn around, the boy's cracked lips, the careful way Ethan had said he was trying not to be hungry anymore. He told him about the 4 days alone, the missing mother, the trestle bridge, the Marshall sweep. He told him about Mamie's diner, about Ben Pruitt, about Marshall Hicks, about the wire from Tucson. Reardon listened without interrupting. His eyes never left Daniel's face. When Daniel finished, Reardon was quiet for a long moment. "Now tell me about the uncle," Reardon said. "Richard Miller. He came on the Thursday stage from Seattle, said he saw the paper and came as fast as he could. He's got money, lawyers, a surgeon in San Francisco who says they can fix the boy's leg. And what does he want? He wants custody. He thinks he can give the boy more than I can." "Can he?" Daniel looked at the ground between his boots. "By every measure that matters to a court? Yes. He's got a house, an income, connections. I've got a room above a stable and a job that pays 35 cents a day. But you're not going to step aside?" "No." Reardon nodded slowly. He unfolded the paper on his knee and studied it for a moment. Then he looked up. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight. Mamie told me about your daughter, Clara." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. He had known this was coming, had been bracing for it since the moment Mamie had slid that piece of paper across the counter. But knowing didn't make it easier. "What happened?" Reardon asked. His voice was not accusatory. It was the flat, professional tone of a man gathering facts. "I was drunk," Daniel said. The words came out rough, scraped. "I came home from a cattle drive with a month's wages and a thirst I couldn't reason with. I put my daughter on the back of a horse and rode from my brother's place in the dark because I thought I was sober enough to make the trip. I was not." He paused. The memory rose up like something physical. The feel of the reins in his hands, the weight of Clara's small arms around his waist, the way the horse had shied at something on the trail, the sound she had made when she fell, the silence after. The horse spooked on a bad stretch of road. She fell. She did not get up. His voice was flat, emptied of emotion by years of repetition. "I have not had a drink since the morning of her funeral. That was 6 years ago." Reardon wrote something in a small leather book with a pencil that needed sharpening. He did not look up. "Were there other incidents? Other times you drank and put yourself or others at risk?" "Yes." "How many?" "Enough that I stopped counting. Enough that my wife left before Clara was born. Enough that I was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I was not a good man, Mr. Reardon. I was a drunk who happened to have a good hand with horses and a strong back for work. That was all I was. And now? Now I'm a man who has not had a drink in 6 years, and who sat down in the dirt beside a 5-year-old boy because nobody else would stop." Reardon looked up from his book. He studied Daniel for a long moment with those sharp, unreadable eyes. Then he closed the book and put it back in his satchel. "Richard Miller's lawyers will use that against you," he said. "They'll put it in front of the judge and frame you as a man who already killed one child through recklessness and is now seeking custody of another. That's the argument they'll make. It's a strong argument. I know. You could walk away from this. Let the uncle take him. By any objective measure, Richard Miller can give that boy more than you ever could. I know. But you're not walking away. No." Reardon pulled at the worn edge of his sleeve, a habitual gesture Daniel would come to recognize over the following days. "Then here's what we need," he said, and he started talking. He talked for 45 minutes, laying out the strategy, the legal arguments, the potential pitfalls. He talked about character witnesses, about the judge assigned to the case, a man named Caleb Whitmore, known for being fair but rigorous. He talked about the importance of presenting Daniel not as a man who had made mistakes, but as a man who had redeemed them. He talked about the boy's testimony, if the judge allowed it. And when he was done, he looked at Daniel and said, "This is not going to be easy, and I cannot guarantee we will win." "I'm not asking for guarantees," Daniel said. "I'm asking for a chance to say my piece." Reardon nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." He stood, dusted off his trousers, and picked up his satchel. "I'll be at the hotel if you need me. We'll file the papers tomorrow morning. The hearing is set for Friday." "Friday," Daniel repeated. 4 days away. Reardon paused at the corner of the stable. "One more thing," he said. "The boy, he knows what's at stake? He knows there's going to be a hearing. He knows his uncle wants to take him to Seattle. And what does he want?" Daniel thought about Ethan's face in the diner, the way the boy had looked at Richard, then at him, then gone back to his sums without answering the question. "He told me he knows what he wants, but he hasn't told me what it is." "Maybe he's saving it for when it matters most," Reardon said. And then he was gone. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity that felt both too fast and impossibly slow. Daniel continued to work the road crew because he could not afford to miss a day's wages, and because the rhythm of the pickaxe kept his mind from spinning out into the dark places it wanted to go. He came home each evening to find Ethan at Mamie's, doing his sums or sorting beans or helping where he could, and they would walk back to the stable together in the cooling dusk. They did not talk much about the hearing. Ethan asked questions, careful, precise questions, and Daniel answered them honestly. Yes, the judge would hear from both sides. Yes, Richard's lawyers would probably say things about Daniel that were hard to hear. No, Daniel did not know what the judge would decide. "I don't like not knowing," Ethan said one evening as they sat on the boardwalk outside the stable, watching the last light fade from the sky. "I don't like it either," Daniel said, "but sometimes not knowing is all we got. The trick is to keep moving anyway." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I was under the bridge, I didn't know if Mama was coming back, but I kept waiting anyway." "That's the same thing," Daniel said. "You kept moving. Even when you couldn't go anywhere, you kept moving inside." Ethan looked at him. "Is that what you did? After Clara?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had not told Ethan about Clara, had not told anyone about Clara except Reardon and Mamie, who had heard it from the town gossip long before Daniel ever arrived in Harlan's Crossing. He did not know how much the boy had overheard, or how much had been passed along by the well-meaning or the cruel. "Who told you about Clara?" Daniel asked carefully. "Nobody told me," Ethan said. "I heard Mamie talking to Mr. Carver. She said you had a little girl who died, and that's why you looked so sad sometimes." He paused. "I know what sad looks like, Daniel. I've seen enough of it." Daniel stared at the darkening street ahead of him. The lamps were being lit in the windows across the way. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The ordinary sounds of a town settling into night. "Yes," he said finally, "that's what I did. I kept moving inside." Ethan nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he leaned his crutch against the boardwalk and sat in the dirt beside Daniel's boots, the way he had sat beside the hitching post on that first afternoon. But this time, he was not alone. "I think," Ethan said quietly, That when people stop moving inside, that's when they die. Even if they're still breathing. Daniel looked at the small boy sitting in the dust beside him. The crutch was on the ground. The twisted leg was stretched out at an awkward angle. The dark eyes were fixed on the horizon with the patient, unwavering gaze of someone who had learned to watch for things that mattered. "Where did you learn that?" Daniel asked. "I don't know," Ethan said. "I just know it's true." Thursday arrived with a heat that seemed personal, as though the sun had decided to make a point about who was in charge. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock Friday morning, and the town was buzzing with the kind of energy that comes when something unusual is about to happen in a place where nothing unusual ever does. Daniel did not go to work that day. Reardon had told him to take the day to prepare, to rest, to make sure he was clear-headed and steady for what was coming. So Daniel spent the morning cleaning the room above the stable, sweeping the floor, washing the windows, folding the blankets with a precision that bordered on ritual. He was not cleaning because the room needed it. He was cleaning because he needed something to do with his hands. Ethan sat at the table and watched him. The boy had his arithmetic book open in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was watching Daniel move around the room with the quiet attention of someone cataloging details. "You're nervous," Ethan said. Daniel stopped mid-sweep. He looked at the broom in his hands, then at the boy. "I reckon I am." "I get nervous too," Ethan said, "before something bad happens. But you told me not to eat like there won't be food tomorrow. So maybe you shouldn't clean like there won't be a room tomorrow." Daniel stood very still. The words hit him with a force that surprised him. The simple, unadorned wisdom of a child who had learned to see through pretense because pretense had never done him any good. "You're right," Daniel said. He leaned the broom against the wall and sat down across from Ethan at the table. "I'm sorry. I've been acting like this is the last day of something instead of the first day of something else." "It might be the last day," Ethan said with that devastating practicality. "We don't know yet." "No, we don't, but I reckon I'd rather spend it sitting with you than sweeping a floor that's already clean." Ethan's face did something that was almost a smile. Not quite. He was still too careful for that, but it was close. They sat together in the quiet of the room, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, the dust motes dancing in the light. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In the late afternoon, a knock came at the door. Daniel opened it to find Margaret Miller's Uncle Richard standing on the landing, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "I'm not here to make trouble," Richard said before Daniel could speak. "I was wondering if I could talk to Ethan. Alone." Daniel looked back at Ethan, who had turned in his chair and was watching the door with those careful, measuring eyes. The boy nodded once. "I'll be downstairs," Daniel said. "Take your time." He walked down the outside stairs and stood in the stable yard, giving them privacy. He could hear the low murmur of voices through the open window above, but not the words. He leaned against the stable wall and waited. It was nearly an hour before Richard came down. His face was different than it had been on the day he arrived, less rigid, less certain. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Daniel. "He's a remarkable child," Richard said. "I know. I told him I would not fight him. Whatever he decides, I will support it." Daniel said nothing. "I also told him that the offer of surgery still stands, regardless of the outcome of the hearing. That is not a negotiation. That is not a bargaining chip. That boy's leg can be fixed, and I have the means to fix it. He should not have to limp through life because the adults around him cannot agree on where he should sleep." Daniel looked at Richard for a long moment. He thought about pride. He thought about the many ways pride had cost him over the years. He thought about Ethan's leg, the drag of it through the dust, the way the boy never complained. "That's his call," Daniel said. "Not mine." "Already asked him," Richard said. "He said he would think about it." A pause. "He told me that you taught him it's all right to take time before answering." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening. "I did," Richard nodded. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the sky. "I was wrong about you, Brooks. I came here thinking I knew exactly what kind of man you were. I was certain of it, and I was wrong." "People get things wrong all the time," Daniel said. "What matters is what they do when they find out." Richard looked at him. "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, But I want you to know that whatever the judge decides, I will not make this harder than it needs to be. For his sake. That's all I ask, Daniel said. They stood in the stable yard for a moment longer, two men on opposite sides of a battle that neither of them had wanted, both of them trying to find their way to the same ground. Then Richard turned and walked back toward the hotel, and Daniel climbed the stairs to the room above the stable. Ethan was sitting at the table where they had left him. The arithmetic book was still open, but he had turned to a fresh page and was drawing something with the pencil. A horse, Daniel realized. A small, rough sketch of a horse with a boy on its back. "That's good," Daniel said, sitting down across from him. "I've been watching Mr. Carver's horses," Ethan said without looking up. "They're beautiful, the way they move." "They are. Do you think I could learn to ride? If my leg gets fixed?" "I think you could learn to do whatever you set your mind to." Ethan paused, his pencil hovering over the paper. "Uncle Richard said the surgery wouldn't make my leg perfect, but it would make it better. I would walk straighter. I wouldn't need the crutch as much." "That's what he told me, too." "Would you still want me, if I didn't need the crutch anymore?" The question was asked so quietly, so carefully, that Daniel almost missed it. He looked at the boy, at the downcast eyes, the pencil frozen mid-stroke, the small shoulders held tight with the effort of asking. "Ethan," Daniel said, and his voice was rough, "I didn't take you in because of your leg. I took you in because you were sitting alone in the dirt and nobody else would stop. That hasn't changed. It's not going to change." The boy's pencil moved again, a small, shaky line. He didn't look up, but his shoulders dropped just slightly. "Okay," he said. "I just wanted to be sure." "You can be sure. I'm not going anywhere." That night, Ethan did not have nightmares. He slept straight through until dawn, his breathing deep and even, his face peaceful in a way that Daniel had not seen since the first night. Daniel lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of the boy breathing, feeling the weight of what was coming settle over him like a blanket. He thought about Clara. He thought about the road he had traveled to get here, the years of drinking, the loss, the guilt that had followed him like a shadow. He thought about the moment he had turned around on that dusty street, the silence that had pulled him back. He thought about the small boy sleeping in the cot across the room and the fierce, fragile trust that had grown between them. He did not know what the judge would decide. He did not know if he was worthy of the chance he was asking for. But he knew that he would show up tomorrow and say his piece, because that was what you did when something mattered. You showed up. You stayed. You did not run. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Harlan's Crossing, Daniel Brooks got dressed in his cleanest shirt, helped Ethan into his, and walked with him to the town hall where his future would be decided. The town hall of Harlan's Crossing had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered on that Friday morning. By 8:45, every bench was filled, and latecomers lined the walls, standing with their hats in their hands and their eyes fixed on the front of the room, where a simple wooden table and a single chair had been arranged for Judge Caleb Whitmore. The air was thick with the smell of wool and sweat and the particular tension of a community holding its breath. Daniel sat at a table on the left side of the room, Tom Reardon beside him with his battered satchel open and a stack of papers arranged in front of him with the precision of a man who knew exactly where every fact lived. Across the aisle, Richard Miller sat with his two lawyers, Holt and Parrish, who wore matching gray suits and carried matching leather cases and spoke to each other in low, efficient murmurs that never quite reached the ears of the onlookers. Ethan was not in the room. That had been Reardon's call the night before, and Daniel had agreed, though it had cost him something to nod his head and say yes. The boy was waiting in the small storage room behind the hall with Mamie, who had volunteered to stay with him until he was needed. Daniel had squeezed Ethan's shoulder before they parted, and Ethan had looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Judge Whitmore entered at exactly 9 o'clock. He was a broad man with a white beard that covered most of his chest, and the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who had been making difficult decisions for 30 years and had made peace with the weight of them. He set his papers on the table, adjusted his spectacles, and looked out at the room with a gaze that took in everything and gave nothing away. "This court is now in session," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. We are here to determine the temporary custody of Ethan Miller, a minor child, pending the recovery and reunification of his mother, Margaret Miller. The parties present are Mr. Daniel Brooks, who has had physical custody of the child for the past 2 weeks, and Mr. Richard Miller, the child's maternal uncle, who has petitioned for custody. Let us proceed. Holt rose first. He was a tall man with a narrow face and the kind of voice that sounded reasonable even when he was saying something devastating. He spoke for 18 minutes, and in that time he laid out the case for Richard Miller with the methodical efficiency of a carpenter building a coffin. He presented Richard's financial records, his property holdings in Seattle, his professional standing as a merchant with a spotless reputation. He produced a letter from a surgeon in San Francisco who had reviewed Ethan's case and believed the leg could be substantially corrected with 3 operations over 2 years. He presented an enrollment offer from a school that specialized in children with physical limitations. He painted a picture of a future filled with opportunity, stability, and care, a future that only money and connections could provide. And then he paused. With respect to the current custodian, Mr. Daniel Brooks, Holt said, and his voice shifted by exactly 1 degree, not louder, not sharper, but more precise. The court should be made aware of the following. He read the record. The drunk driving incident from 7 years prior, Clara's name, Clara's age, the coroner's report, Daniel's conviction for involuntary manslaughter due to negligence. The sentence served, 18 months in the territorial prison. The room went very quiet. Daniel kept his eyes forward, his hands flat on the table in front of him. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against him like a physical force. The question before this court, Holt concluded, is not whether Mr. Brooks is in some general sense a decent man. The question is whether a child with Ethan Miller's particular needs, medical, physical, financial, is best served by remaining in the care of a man who has already demonstrated, under circumstances of his own making, that a child in his care is not safe. He sat down. The silence that followed was absolute. Reardon stood up slowly. He was a small man, and he did not have 2 matching suits or a leather case full of documents. He looked at the judge, then at the room, then at Daniel for a brief moment before he began to speak. He spoke for only 4 minutes. He did not try to match Holt's parade of evidence. Instead, he said this, that the question before the court was not a balance sheet, but a child. That a child was not a financial instrument. That the measure of a man fit to raise a child was not his bank account, but his presence. That Daniel Brooks had made a terrible mistake 7 years ago, and had spent every day since paying for it in ways that no court could sentence. That he had not touched alcohol since the morning of his daughter's funeral. That he had taken in a stranger's child with nothing to gain and everything to lose. And then Reardon said, "Your Honor, there is one person in this room qualified to speak to Daniel Brooks's presence, and that person is 5 years old and waiting outside the door. I'd like to call Ethan Miller." Holt was on his feet before the sentence finished. "Your Honor, the boy is 5 years old. He cannot be considered a competent witness. He is the subject of this proceeding," Reardon said without raising his voice. "This court is deciding his future. With respect, if that boy cannot speak to his own future, then I don't know who can." Judge Whitmore looked at Holt, looked at Reardon, pulled his beard once with a slow, thoughtful motion. "I'll hear him," he said. "Informally. No oath. Just a conversation." He looked at the door. "Bring him in." Daniel turned in his seat. The door at the back of the hall opened, and Ethan came through it on his crutch, wearing the clean shirt Daniel had bought him at the dry goods store 3 days ago. The same dry goods store owned by Ben Pruitt, a fact that had cost Daniel some private amusement that now felt like a lifetime ago. Mamie was behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She let go when he started forward, and Ethan moved slowly and steadily through the crowded room, his crutch tapping against the wooden floor in a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of Daniel's heart. He did not look at anyone except Daniel, just a quick, precise look that said, "I'm here, and I'm all right, and don't worry." Daniel held the look for 1 second before Ethan moved past him to the front of the room. Judge Whitmore leaned forward in his chair and looked at Ethan the way a man looks at something that matters. "You know who I am," he asked. "You're the judge," Ethan said. "You're going to decide where I live." "That's right. Does that scare you?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "A little," he said, "but I know what I want to say." "Then say it," Whitmore said. "In your own time. Nobody's going to rush you." Ethan stood straight. His crutch was under his left arm, his right hand at his side. Daniel could see from where he sat that the boy's fingers were pressing tight against his leg, not visibly trembling, but working the way hands work when a person is holding very still on purpose. "My Uncle Richard is a good man," Ethan began. His voice was clear and careful, carrying through the silent room. "He came a long way when he heard I needed help. He's going to help my mama get well. He can give me surgeries and a school and a room with my own window." He paused. "Those are good things." Holt wrote something on his paper. Richard Miller sat motionless at his table, his hands clasped in front of him. "But I want to stay with Daniel." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Whitmore waited. "Why?" he asked. And Ethan Miller, 5 years old, one leg twisted from birth, standing in a crowded town hall in Harlan's Crossing, Arizona Territory, on the hottest Friday morning in August, looked at the judge and said, "Because he waited." The room did not make a sound. "Everybody else looked at me and kept going," Ethan continued. His voice was steady, utterly without drama, the way children tell the truth when nobody has taught them yet to decorate it. "I sat next to that hitching post for 4 days. People walked past me in the morning, and they walked past me in the afternoon, and they walked past me when it was so hot I couldn't think straight. Some of them looked at me and then looked away. Some of them didn't look at all." He paused. His fingers pressed harder against his leg. "Daniel looked at me, and then he sat down." Whitmore said nothing. "He sat in the dirt in the middle of the street," Ethan went on, "and he waited while I ate. He didn't stand over me. He didn't hold the food out and wait for me to thank him. He sat down, same as me, and he waited until I was done." The boy's voice wavered for just a moment, then steadied. "Nobody ever did that before, not once, not the whole time I can remember. Somewhere in the third row, a woman made a sound that she covered immediately with her hand. It might have been Mamie. It might have been someone else. After," Ethan said, "when people wanted to take me somewhere, I grabbed his sleeve. I told him, 'Please don't let them put me outside again.' And he didn't. He didn't fight anybody. He didn't make any speeches. He just said, 'He stays with me.' And he said it like it was already decided." Whitmore had not moved. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, his eyes fixed on the boy. "My Uncle Richard can give me surgeries," Ethan said. "But Daniel gave me breakfast. He gave me breakfast yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. He taught me that there would be food tomorrow. I didn't know that before." He looked at the judge with those dark, measuring eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. "He sits with me when I eat. He doesn't rush. He doesn't stand at the door. He sits down, same as me, and he waits until I'm done." The room was absolutely still. "Uncle Richard can give me things I can touch," Ethan said. "Daniel gives me things I can't touch. I don't know the word for that, but I know it's more important." Ethan stopped. He had said what he came to say. He stood there, small and straight-backed, his crutch steady under his arm, and waited. Judge Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, not in volume, but in texture, like something rough had been sanded down to the grain. "No, son," he said, "that's enough." He looked at Holt, who had half risen from his seat, and the look silenced him before he could speak. Then Whitmore looked at Richard Miller. "Mr. Miller," the judge said, "you want to say anything?" Richard looked at his nephew for a long moment. Ethan looked back at him without defiance and without apology, just the same careful, measuring look that was the boy's particular way of being honest. "I want what's right for him," Richard said at last. His voice was quieter than it had been all morning. "I came here believing I knew what that was." He paused. "I'm not sure I was right." Whitmore nodded slowly. Then he looked at the room, at the crowded benches and the standing onlookers, at Ben Pruitt in the second row with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, at Mamie leaning against the back wall with her apron still on. "I'm going to take a recess," Whitmore said. "I'll return with my decision in 1 hour." He stood, gathered his papers, and left the room through a door at the back. The moment he was gone, the room erupted into low, urgent conversation. People stood, stretched, moved toward the doors. Holt and Parrish leaned in toward Richard, speaking in rapid, hushed voices. Richard did not respond. He was looking at Ethan, who had not moved from his spot at the front of the room. Daniel stood up and walked to the boy. He crouched down in front of him, the same way he had crouched down in the dirt beside the hitching post 2 weeks ago. "You did good," Daniel said. "Real good." Ethan looked at him. "Was that enough?" "I don't know," Daniel said honestly. "But there ain't nothing else we could have said that would have mattered more." Ethan nodded. He let himself be led to a chair near the wall, where Mamie brought him a cup of water and a piece of cornbread she had produced from somewhere, because Mamie always produced food when food was needed. He ate slowly, carefully, but with less of the guarded watchfulness than before. He had said what he needed to say. Whatever happened next was out of his hands. The hour passed like a slow bleed. Daniel sat at his table with Reardon, who was reviewing his notes in silence. Across the aisle, Richard Miller sat alone. His lawyers had stepped outside to confer. He looked at Daniel once, and there was something in his eyes that was not hostility. At exactly 10 minutes past 10, the door at the back opened, and Judge Whitmore returned. The room snapped to attention. He sat, arranged his papers, and looked out at the crowd with the deliberate, settled authority of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. "In the matter of Ethan Miller," he said, "this court finds as follows." Daniel put both hands flat on the table in front of him. He did not breathe. "Temporary custody," Whitmore said, "is granted to Daniel Brooks." The room broke open. The noise lasted exactly 4 seconds before Whitmore's gavel came down twice, hard, and the room went quiet again. But those 4 seconds told Daniel everything. Half the room exhaled like they had been holding their breath for an hour. Mamie made a sound that was not quite a word. Carver, standing near the back, put his hat on and took it off again. Marshal Hicks unfolded his arms, and Ben Pruitt pressed his lips into a flat, bloodless line and stared at the floor. Daniel looked at Ethan. The boy was still sitting in his chair, his crutch across his knees, his face unreadable. But his shoulders had dropped just slightly, the way they dropped when a weight he had been carrying was set down. Whitmore was not finished. "Temporary custody to Daniel Brooks," he repeated, "pending the following conditions." He looked at his papers. "Mr. Brooks will maintain stable housing for the child. Mr. Brooks will ensure the child receives appropriate medical evaluation within 30 days. This court will review the arrangement in 6 months, at which time all parties may present updated circumstances." He looked up. "Mr. Miller." Richard turned from looking at his nephew. "Your resources have been noted," Whitmore said. "The court encourages you to remain involved in this child's life in whatever capacity serves his well-being. That is not a ruling. That is a suggestion from an old man who has watched too many families break apart over who wins, and not enough think about what winning is actually for." He closed his papers. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down one more time. Holt was on his feet immediately, speaking to Richard in a low, rapid voice. Daniel caught the word appeal, and then Reardon's hand was on his shoulder. "Don't look at them," Reardon said quietly. "Go get your boy." Daniel stood up. He crossed the aisle. Ethan was still sitting in his chair near the front, very straight, crutch across his knees, waiting. The way he always waited. Not anxious, not impatient, just present. Daniel reached him and stopped. He did not know what to say. The words that mattered seemed too big for the moment. Ethan looked up at him. "We won," the boy said. "We won." Ethan nodded once. Then he said, "My leg hurts from standing so long." "Let's get you out of here," Daniel said, and held out his hand. Ethan took it and got himself upright. They walked out of the Harlan's Crossing Town Hall together into the August morning, and the door swung shut behind them. The crowd spilled out onto the street behind them, but Daniel did not look back. He walked with Ethan toward Mamie's diner, the boy's crutch tapping a steady rhythm on the boardwalk. The sun was already high, the heat building toward another brutal afternoon. But for the first time in 2 weeks, the air felt different, lighter. They were halfway to the diner when they heard footsteps behind them. Daniel turned. Richard Miller was walking toward them, alone, without his lawyers. "Brooks," Richard said when he reached them. He stopped, caught his breath. He looked at Ethan first, then at Daniel. "I'm not going to fight this," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not going to appeal. I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be." Daniel waited. Richard looked at his nephew. "I'm going to Tucson tomorrow to see your mother. I'm going to make sure she has everything she needs to get well, and I'm going to come back." He paused. "If that's all right with you." Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Ethan looked back at his uncle. "You can come back," he said. "You can have dinner with us. Mamie makes good cornbread." Something in Richard Miller's face moved, like a fault line shifting. He pressed his mouth together briefly. "I'd like that," he said. Then he looked at Daniel, and the look between them was the look of two men who had been on opposite sides of a table and were now somehow on the same side of a problem. Neither of them entirely sure how to navigate that, but both of them willing to try. "The surgeries," Richard said. "The San Francisco physician. I want to fund that, regardless of anything else." He held Daniel's eyes. "That's not a negotiation. That's not me trying to—" He stopped, started again. "That boy's leg can be fixed, and I have the money to fix it. Let me do that much." Daniel looked at him for a moment. He thought about pride, which he had always had too much of. He thought about Ethan's twisted leg and the way the boy dragged it through the dirt, and had never once complained about it in Daniel's hearing. "That's Ethan's call," Daniel said, "not mine." They both looked at the boy. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Will it hurt?" he asked. "Some," Richard said honestly. "The doctor said the recovery is hard, but he said you'd walk better, a lot better." He paused. "Maybe you'd walk without the crutch." Ethan looked at the crutch under his arm. He had had it, or versions of it, for as long as he could remember. He looked at it the way people look at things that have been both limitation and lifeline, not sure how to feel about the possibility of their absence. "Okay," he said finally. "Tell him okay." Richard Miller reached out and put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Not grabbing, not pulling, just a brief, honest contact. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said in there. You didn't have to be that fair to me." Ethan looked up at him with those level, measuring eyes. "You came," the boy said simply. "When you saw the paper, you came." Richard nodded. His throat moved. He did not say anything else. He tipped his hat at Daniel, picked up his valise from where he had set it on the boardwalk, and walked back toward the hotel. Daniel watched him go. Something in his chest that had been clenched tight all morning loosened by one careful degree. He looked down at Ethan. "You ready for that cornbread?" "I'm ready," Ethan said. They walked the rest of the way to Mamie's together, the August sun beating down on the dusty street, the sound of the crutch and the boots mingling in a rhythm that had become familiar. Behind them, the town of Harlan's Crossing buzzed with the news of what had happened in the town hall. Ahead of them, Mamie was already standing in the doorway of the diner, wiping her hands on her apron, a look on her face that was not quite a smile, but close enough. Daniel Brooks had won the right to keep the boy who had stopped him on a dusty street 2 weeks ago. But as he pushed open the door to Mamie's diner and held it for Ethan to pass through, he understood something that had been building in him since the moment he first sat down in the dirt beside that broken hitching post. He had not won because he was the better man. He had won because a 5-year-old boy had stood up in front of a room full of strangers and said, with the simple, devastating honesty that only children possess, that being seen was more important than being provided for. That presence mattered more than possessions. That the man who sits down beside you in the dirt is worth more than all the surgeons in San Francisco. And Daniel knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like the heat of the Arizona sun, that the real work was only beginning. The first week after the hearing passed like water through a sieve, slow enough to feel every drop, fast enough that Daniel woke each morning surprised to find another day had arrived. The rhythm of life above Carver's stable settled into something that was not quite routine, but was beginning to resemble one. Daniel rose before dawn, built the fire, put coffee on to boil. Ethan woke to the smell of it, washed his face and hands at the basin, and sat at the table with his arithmetic book without being told. They ate breakfast together in the gray, early light, the window open to the sounds of the stable below, and then Daniel walked him to Mamie's before heading to the road crew. It was not a glamorous life. It was not the life Richard Miller had offered, but it was theirs. The nightmares did not stop entirely, but they came less often. 3 times in the first week, twice in the second. Each time, Daniel woke at the first sound of the boy's cry, crossed the room in the dark, and sat on the floor beside the cot until Ethan's breathing steadied. He did not offer words of comfort that felt hollow. He simply stayed, a solid presence in the darkness, and let the boy feel the weight of someone who would not leave. On the 10th night after the hearing, Ethan slept through until dawn without waking once. Daniel found himself standing over the cot in the morning light, watching the boy's peaceful face, and something in his chest shifted, a loosening of a knot he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was there. Mamie took it upon herself to teach Daniel to cook. She did not announce it as a lesson, because Mamie did not announce things. She simply appeared in the stable room in the late afternoons with a pot or a pan and a sack of ingredients, and she talked through what she was doing while she did it. Daniel watched and helped and burned things and learned. "You're burning the onions again," Ethan observed from the table one evening, his pencil suspended over his arithmetic. "I know I'm burning the onions," Daniel said through gritted teeth. "Mamie says you burn them on purpose because you don't have the patience to go slow." Daniel turned to look at Mamie, who was standing in the doorway with her arms folded and an expression of complete vindication. "Mamie talks too much," he said. Ethan looked at Mamie. "He says you talk too much." "I heard him," Mamie said. "She doesn't seem offended," Ethan observed. "I'm never offended by accurate information," Mamie said, and came in and moved Daniel aside and fixed the onions. These were the small moments, and Daniel collected them without meaning to, the way a man in the desert collects water, not from any plan, but from the deep, involuntary recognition of what keeps a person alive. Ethan's first unprompted laugh at the sight of Carver's tabby cat stealing a piece of cornbread off the table. The way the boy's shoulders had started to relax when he sat down to eat. The guarded watchfulness slowly giving way to something softer. The morning Ethan asked for a second serving of breakfast without first checking to see if there was enough. Each small easing was a victory, one not in a courtroom but in the quiet hours of ordinary days. Richard Miller returned to Harlan's Crossing 2 weeks after the hearing, as he had promised. He came on the Thursday stage with a leather satchel full of papers from the San Francisco surgeon and a letter from Margaret that he had carried all the way from Tucson. He found Daniel at the stable, repairing a broken halter, and stood in the doorway until Daniel looked up. "She's improving," Richard said without preamble. "The doctors say another week, maybe 2, and she can be discharged." She asked about Ethan every day, every single day. Daniel set down the halter. "When can she travel?" "She's not strong enough for a stage yet, but I've made arrangements for her to stay with a woman in Tucson for a few weeks after she's released. A boarding house run by a widow who takes in recovering patients. When the doctor clears her for travel, I'll send word." Daniel nodded. He picked up the halter again, ran his thumb along a worn seam. "Does she know about the hearing?" "She knows. I wrote her a long letter." Richard paused. "She wrote one back. It's addressed to you." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded envelope, creased and worn from travel. Daniel took it, looked at it, did not open it. "Read it when you're ready," Richard said. "She's not an easy woman to know, Margaret, but she's a good one." Daniel waited until after Ethan was asleep to open the letter. He sat at the table with the lamp burning low, the window open to the night sounds of the stable, and unfolded the paper with hands that were steadier than he felt. The handwriting was small and careful, the letters slightly uneven, in the way of someone who had written from a bed propped against pillows. "Mr. Brooks, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my son. Richard told me everything, about the day you found him, about the hearing, about the way you've cared for him. I have spent many nights in this hospital bed trying to find the words to tell you what it means to me that my child was not alone, that someone stopped. I know I am not entitled to ask anything of you. I have no money, no home, no way to repay the kindness you have shown. but I am asking anyway. Please keep him safe until I can come for him. Please tell him every day that his mother loves him and that she is coming back. Please let him know that not all adults leave. I will be on my feet soon. I will find work. I will find a place for us. And when I do, I will come to Harlan's Crossing, and I will thank you properly, on my knees if I have to. Until then, I am in your debt. Margaret Miller. Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in his coat pocket, and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of Ethan breathing in the cot across the room. The weeks that followed were a slow, steady building of something that felt almost like stability. Daniel continued to work the road crew, but he had started taking on extra jobs in the evenings, repairing a fence for Carver, hauling firewood for the widow who ran the boarding house, anything that added a few more cents to the jar he kept hidden in the cupboard. He was saving for the winter, for the medical evaluation the judge had ordered, for the inevitable day when Margaret would return and the future would need to be reckoned with. Ethan, for his part, had become a fixture at Mamie's diner. He arrived each morning after breakfast, set himself up at the back table with his arithmetic book, and worked through the morning with a concentration that impressed even Mamie. In the afternoons, he helped where he could, sorting beans, wiping tables, carrying plates when the load was light enough for his crutch to manage. He did not complain about the work, and he did not ask for payment. He simply showed up, the way Daniel had shown up for him, and made himself useful. "You got a good boy there," Mamie said to Daniel one evening when he came to collect Ethan at the end of the day. They stood at the counter, watching Ethan at the back table, carefully stacking salt shakers in a perfect pyramid. "I know," Daniel said. "He's got a good heart, and a strong one, but he's still scared." Daniel looked at her. "What's he scared of?" "That you'll leave." Mamie's voice was matter-of-fact. "That his mama will leave. That everyone he trusts will eventually walk away. He's been shown that pattern too many times. It'll take more than a few weeks to unteach it." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How do I unteach it?" "You don't," Mamie said. "You just keep showing up, day after day. Eventually, his heart will believe what his eyes are seeing." Daniel thought about that as he walked Ethan back to the stable that evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a town as ordinary as Harlan's Crossing. The boy's crutch tapped a steady rhythm beside him, and the dust rose in small puffs with each step. "Daniel," Ethan said as they reached the stable stairs. "Yeah, Mama's coming back soon, isn't she?" The question hung in the cooling air. Daniel stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned to face the boy. "Your Uncle Richard says she's getting stronger every day. When the doctor says she's ready, she'll come." Ethan nodded. He looked at the ground, then up at Daniel. "Where will I live when she comes back?" Daniel had known this question was coming. He had been turning it over in his mind for weeks, trying to find an answer that would not break something fragile that was still growing. "That depends on what your mama wants," Daniel said carefully, "and what you want, and what we can work out together. You want me to stay with you?" "Ethan, I want what's right for you. That's all I've ever wanted." Ethan looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes. "What if what's right for me is both?" Daniel did not know how to answer that, so he did the only thing he knew to do. He reached out and put his hand on the boy's shoulder, the way Richard had done in front of the town hall. "Then we'll figure out how to make that happen," he said. "One day at a time." They climbed the stairs together, and Daniel lit the lamp, and Ethan washed his face and hands and settled into his cot. Daniel sat at the table and watched the boy's breathing slow into sleep. And he thought about the letter in his coat pocket, and the woman who had written it, and the future that was bearing down on them like an approaching storm. The medical evaluation came first. Judge Whitmore had ordered it within 30 days, and Daniel was determined to comply. He arranged for a doctor from Tucson, the only one in the territory who had any experience with a child's leg like Ethan's, to come to Harlan's Crossing for a day. It cost Daniel nearly a week's wages, but he paid without complaint. The doctor was a thin man with spectacles and gentle hands. He examined Ethan in the back room of Mamie's diner, with Daniel standing in the corner and Mamie hovering near the door. The examination took nearly an hour, and through it all, Ethan sat still and silent, answering questions in his careful, precise way, flinching only when the doctor manipulated the twisted joint. When it was over, the doctor washed his hands and spoke to Daniel in the quiet tone of a man delivering news he wished were different. "The leg is not beyond help," he said, "but it will require surgery, multiple surgeries, likely 3 over the course of 2 years. The recovery will be painful, and there is no guarantee of full correction. But he will walk better than he does now. Substantially better." "How much would it cost?" The doctor named a figure that made Daniel's stomach drop. It was more than he made in a year, more than he could save in 5 years at his current wages. "I'll find a way," Daniel said. The doctor looked at him. "There is a surgeon in San Francisco who specializes in this kind of work. Richard Miller has already contacted him, I believe." Daniel nodded. He had known this was coming. He had been bracing for it since the moment Richard had made the offer outside the town hall. "I know," he said. The doctor left, and Daniel sat down at the table across from Ethan, who was putting his shirt back on with slow, deliberate movements. "It's going to hurt," Ethan said. It was not a question. "Some," Daniel said, "but your Uncle Richard knows a surgeon who can fix it. He's already made arrangements." "I know. You want to do it?" Ethan finished buttoning his shirt and looked at Daniel. "I want to walk without this," he said, touching the crutch leaning against the table. "I want to run. I want to ride a horse." "Then we'll do it." "When?" "When your Uncle Richard says the surgeon is ready. Maybe in the spring." Ethan absorbed this. He picked up his crutch and stood, testing his weight against it with the familiar, practiced motion. "That's a long time." "Good things take time." "Did it take you a long time to learn not to drink?" The question caught Daniel off guard. He looked at the boy, who was watching him with those steady, unflinching eyes. "Every day for 6 years," Daniel said, "and I'm still learning." Ethan nodded slowly, as if this answer made sense to him. "Then I can wait until spring." The weeks turned into a month, and the month stretched toward autumn. The heat broke in late September, giving way to the milder, golden days of early fall. The cottonwood trees along the main road turned a pale, trembling yellow, and the dust settled a little, and the people of Harlan's Crossing began to breathe again after the long, brutal summer. Marshal Hicks came by the stable one evening with news. Margaret Miller had been discharged from the hospital and was staying at the boarding house in Tucson, gaining strength. The doctors were optimistic. She might be well enough to travel in another month. "She's asking about the boy," Hicks said. "Every letter she sends, she asks about him." "She write to him directly?" Daniel asked. "Not yet. She said she didn't want to confuse him. Didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep until she was sure she could keep them." Daniel understood that. He had seen enough of Margaret Miller's careful, measured handwriting in the letter he still carried in his coat pocket to recognize a woman who had learned not to make promises she could not keep. "Tell her he's fine," Daniel said. "Tell her he's eating, he's sleeping, he's doing his sums. Tell her he's waiting for her." Hicks nodded. "I'll send word." He left, and Daniel stood in the stable yard, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The air was cool for the first time in months, carrying the smell of dry grass and wood smoke from a fire somewhere in town. Ethan came down the stairs, his crutch tapping on the wooden steps. He had been putting himself to bed earlier, though he rarely fell asleep before Daniel came up. He stood beside Daniel and looked up at the stars. "Is Mama getting better?" he asked. "She is. Marshal Hicks says she might be well enough to travel in another month." "That's good." "It is." They stood in silence for a moment. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A horse stamped in the stable, the sound muffled by the walls. "Daniel," Ethan said. "Yeah. When Mama comes, I'm still going to see you. Every day if I can." Daniel looked down at the boy. In the starlight, Ethan's face was serious, his jaw set with the determination that Daniel had come to recognize as the core of who he was. "I'd like that," Daniel said. "Good, because I already told her in a letter. Uncle Richard mailed it for me. So it's decided." Daniel felt something rise in his chest, a warmth that he had not felt in years, maybe ever. "If it's decided, then I reckon it's settled." They climbed the stairs together, and Daniel lit the lamp, and Ethan climbed into his cot with the satisfied air of a general who had successfully secured his position. Within 10 minutes, he was asleep. Daniel sat at the table for a long time, the lamp burning low, the letter from Margaret still in his coat pocket. He did not take it out to read it again. He did not need to. He knew every word. He thought about the spring, the surgery, the recovery, the unknown shape of the future. He thought about Margaret Miller, a woman he had never met, whose son had become the center of his world. He thought about the road crew and the 35 cents a day and the jar of savings in the cupboard, and he knew it was not enough. It would never be enough. But he also knew that he would not stop trying. He would not stop showing up. He would not be the man who walked past. And when he finally blew out the lamp and lay down on his cot, he fell asleep with the sound of Ethan's breathing in his ears and the weight of something like hope pressing against his ribs. Autumn arrived fully in October, painting the foothills in shades of gold and rust. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler, and the first hints of winter began to whisper on the wind. Daniel had added 2 new jobs to his routine, helping Carver with the evening stable work and splitting firewood for the boarding house widow. His hands, already calloused from the road crew, grew harder still. Ethan continued to spend his days at Mamie's, and something in the boy had begun to change. The guarded watchfulness was still there, but it had softened at the edges. He smiled more often. He laughed at the cat's antics. He had started calling Carver's horses by name and talking to them in a low, serious voice when he thought no one was listening. "He's healing," Mamie said one afternoon, watching Ethan through the diner window as he sat on the boardwalk, feeding a piece of cornbread to the tabby. "He is," Daniel said. "You are too." Daniel looked at her. She did not look back. She was still watching Ethan through the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. "I didn't know I needed healing," Daniel said. "That's the thing about wounds," Mamie said. "You get so used to carrying them, you forget they're there. Until somebody comes along and reminds you what it feels like to be whole." She set down her coffee and walked back into the kitchen, leaving Daniel standing at the window, watching the small boy on the boardwalk, feeling something shift in the deep, quiet places of his chest. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was addressed to Ethan, in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven. Margaret's hand, stronger now than it had been in the hospital, but still recovering its steadiness. Daniel handed it to the boy without opening it, and Ethan took it to the table and sat down and read it in silence, his lips moving slightly over the words. When he finished, he looked up. "She's coming," he said. His voice was level, but his hands were trembling. "She's coming next week." Daniel sat down across from him. "That's good. She said she's staying at the boarding house. She said she's got work, washing and mending for the widow who runs the place. She said it's not much, but it's a start." "That is a start." Ethan looked at the letter in his hands. "She said she's proud of me, for doing my sums, for helping Mamie, for—" He stopped, his voice catching. "For being brave." Daniel waited. "She also said she wants to meet you, properly. She said she has a lot to thank you for." "I'd like to meet her properly too." Ethan folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, pressing it flat with his palm. He sat very still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the table. "I'm scared," he said quietly. "I've been waiting for her to come back for so long, and now she's coming, and I'm scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that it won't be the same. Scared that I've changed, and she's changed, and we won't fit together the way we used to." He looked up, and his eyes were bright but dry. "Scared that I'll have to choose." Daniel leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "Ethan, listen to me. You don't have to choose. Your mama loves you. He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "I care about you too. That's not a competition. That's not a choice you have to make. You can love us both. You can have both." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, sharp and precise. "Okay," he said. "I'll try." "You don't have to try. You just have to let it happen." They sat together in the quiet of the room above the stable, the afternoon light slanting through the window, the dust motes dancing in the golden air. Outside, the ordinary sounds of Harlan's Crossing continued, a wagon rumbling past, a dog barking, a woman calling to her child. And inside, a man and a boy sat across from each other, learning together what it meant to let people in. Margaret Miller arrived on a Saturday. The stage pulled in at noon, and Daniel stood with Ethan on the boardwalk outside Mamie's, watching the dust rise around the wheels. The boy had his crutch under one arm, and his other hand pressed flat against his leg, holding himself still. Daniel did not touch him. He just stood close, a solid presence at his side. The stage door opened, and Margaret Miller stepped down. She was thinner than Daniel had imagined, thinner than the photograph he had seen in Richard's papers. Her dark hair was pulled back, her face pale, her movements careful, as if she was still testing the strength of her own body. But her eyes, those same dark, measuring eyes that looked out of Ethan's face, were clear and steady. She saw her son. She did not run. She did not call out. She simply stopped, standing in the middle of the dusty street, and looked at him. And Ethan, who had been holding himself together for months, who had been brave and patient and careful, let go of his crutch and took a step toward her. "Ethan," she said, and her voice broke on the single word, "Mama." She crossed the distance in 4 strides and dropped to her knees in the dirt in front of him. She put her hands on his face, her thumbs moving across his cheeks, checking him, counting the parts, confirming the wholeness. "You're all right," she said. It was barely a sound. "I'm all right," Ethan said. "I told you I'd be all right." "I know you did." She pulled him into her arms, and Ethan buried his face in her shoulder, and they held each other in the middle of the street, while the people of Harlan's Crossing pretended not to watch from behind their curtains and doorways. Daniel stood back, giving them space, his hands in his pockets and his heart somewhere in his throat. He watched Margaret hold her son, and he watched Ethan's shoulders shake with the release of a tension he had been carrying since the night the men with badges came under the trestle bridge. After a long moment, Margaret looked up. She looked at Daniel over the top of Ethan's head, and her eyes were full of tears and gratitude, and something else that he could not quite name. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Ma'am." She released Ethan slowly, keeping one hand on his shoulder, and got to her feet with the careful movements of someone whose body was still relearning how to work. She looked at Daniel for a long moment, and he saw in her face the same wariness and hope that he had seen in Ethan's on that first afternoon. "You saved my son's life," she said. "I just sat down beside him, ma'am." She shook her head. "You did more than that. You showed him that the world wasn't only full of people who walk past. You gave him back something I couldn't give him. I gave him breakfast," Daniel said quietly. "That's all." Margaret looked at him, and something in her face shifted. A recognition, perhaps, that this man was not going to take credit for anything, was not going to demand payment or praise or gratitude. He was simply standing there, steady and present, the same way he had been for her son. "Breakfast matters," she said, "more than most people know." Ethan looked between them, his face unreadable. Then he picked up his crutch from where it had fallen and said, "Mama, are you hungry? Mamie makes good cornbread." Margaret let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I'm hungry," she said. "I've been hungry for a long time." They walked into Mamie's together, the 3 of them, in the golden October light, and the door swung shut behind them, closing on the dusty street and the curious eyes of Harlan's Crossing. Inside, Mamie was already setting a 4th place at the table. They sat at the corner table in Mamie's diner, the one with the window that looked out onto the main street, and Margaret Miller ate cornbread and beans like she had not seen food in weeks. She ate slowly at first, the way Ethan had eaten on that first afternoon, careful, testing, as if she expected the plate to be taken away at any moment. Then, as the warmth of the food settled in her empty stomach, she began to eat with more speed, more hunger, more of the desperate need of a body that had been running on nothing but willpower for too long. Ethan watched her the way he watched everything, with quiet, measuring attention. He did not interrupt her eating. He simply sat across from her, his own plate untouched, his hands folded on the table in front of him, waiting. Daniel stood at the counter, giving them space. He had ordered coffee he did not drink, and was pretending to read a newspaper he had already read twice. Mamie moved around the kitchen with the deliberate noisiness of someone who understood that privacy sometimes needed to be created rather than given. When Margaret finally set down her fork, she looked at her son with an expression that held too many things to name. Relief, grief, love. The particular exhaustion of a woman who had been holding herself together by sheer force of will and was only now beginning to realize she could let some of it go. "You look good," she said. Her voice was rough, still recovering. "I'm eating," Ethan said. "Daniel makes sure I eat." "I can see that." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "You've grown, I think, since—" She stopped, swallowed. "Since before. Daniel says I'm filling out. He says I was too skinny before." "You were too skinny before." Margaret's eyes moved to Daniel, who was still standing at the counter with his useless newspaper. He was right. "I know." Ethan said it simply, without irony, without judgment. "He's right about a lot of things." Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. Then she pushed back her chair and stood, her movements still careful, still testing the limits of her recovered strength. She walked to the counter and stood beside Daniel, who finally lowered the newspaper. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Ma'am? I want to see where my son has been living." It was not a request, it was not a challenge. It was the plain, direct statement of a mother who needed to see with her own eyes the place where her child had been sleeping. Daniel set down the newspaper. "I'll take you there." They walked together, Daniel, Margaret, and Ethan, across the street and down the boardwalk to Carver's stable. The afternoon sun was warm, but not brutal, the first real kindness the weather had shown in months. Ethan led the way on his crutch, his pace steady and familiar, and Margaret watched him move with the particular attention of a mother cataloging details. The room above the stable was clean. Daniel had swept it that morning, had washed the windows, had folded the blankets with the precision that had become his way of preparing for things that mattered. The two cots were made up. The wash basin was clean. The small table held a lamp, and Ethan's arithmetic book, and a pencil laid parallel to the edge. Margaret stood in the doorway and looked at it all. She did not enter immediately. She stood with her hand on the doorframe, her eyes moving slowly across the space, taking in the details that spoke of care. The extra blanket folded at the foot of Ethan's cot, the small shelf where his few belongings were arranged, the hook by the door where his clean shirt hung. "He has his own cot," she said. Her voice was quiet. "He does. He has a place for his things. He needed somewhere to put them." Margaret stepped into the room. She moved to the table and touched the arithmetic book, the pages worn from use. She picked up the pencil and looked at it, then set it down exactly where it had been. "He's been doing his sums," she said. "Every day. Mamie's been teaching him. He never could sit still for sums before. Too much moving. Too much worrying about where the next meal was coming from. He sits still now," Daniel said. "He's got a gift for it, I think. For concentrating. For seeing things through." Margaret turned to face him. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. "You gave him that. I gave him a place to sit. He did the rest." She looked at him for a long moment, and Daniel saw in her face the same thing he had seen in Ethan's on that first afternoon. A careful, measuring assessment, a weighing of whether this person could be trusted. He met her gaze without flinching, the way he had met Ethan's, and waited. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you stop? You didn't know him. You didn't know me. You had nothing to gain." Daniel thought about the question. He had asked himself the same thing many times over the past weeks, and he had never found an answer that felt complete. "I don't know," he said. "I saw him sitting there, and I couldn't keep walking, that's all. There wasn't a reason. There was just—" He stopped, searching for the words. "There was just the knowing that if I kept walking, I would be the kind of man who walks past. And I didn't want to be that man anymore." Margaret was quiet for a long time. The stable sounds drifted up through the floorboards, the shift of hooves, the low murmur of Carver's voice. A fly buzzed against the window. "You're not that man," she said finally. "You stopped. That's all that matters." She sat down on the edge of Ethan's cot, her hands resting on her knees, and looked around the room again. Her shoulders dropped, just slightly, the way shoulders drop when a woman who has been carrying everything alone finally allows herself to feel the presence of someone who might help carry it. "I don't know how to repay you," she said. "I'm not asking for repayment." "I know you're not. That's what makes it harder." Ethan had been standing in the doorway, watching them both. Now he crossed the room and sat down on the cot beside his mother, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Mama," he said, "Daniel says I don't have to choose." Margaret looked at him. "Choose what?" "Between you and him. He says I can have both." Margaret's face did something complicated, a flicker of surprise, then understanding, then something that looked almost like relief. She looked at Daniel over Ethan's head. "You said that?" I did. Why? Because it's true. That boy loves you. He never stopped loving you. And Daniel paused. The words were hard. They were true. And the truth was not something he had said out loud to anyone in a long time. I care about him too. That doesn't take anything away from you. It just means there's more room. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her arm around Ethan and pulled him close, resting her cheek against the top of his head. More room, she repeated, as if testing the words. I think I'd like that. The days that followed were a careful, tentative dance of adjustments. Margaret took a room at the boarding house, the same one where Richard had arranged for her to stay while she recovered. She had found work at the laundry, washing and ironing for 6 cents an hour, 6 days a week, and she rose before dawn each morning and walked across town in the gray light, her hands still weak from the illness but growing stronger with each passing day. She did not try to take Ethan away from Daniel. She did not demand that he come live with her at the boarding house. She understood, in the way that mothers who have survived the worst understand, that her son had found something precious in the room above the stable, and that taking it away from him would damage him in ways she could not repair. Instead, she built a new rhythm. Ethan spent mornings at Mamie's, as he always had. He spent afternoons with Daniel, when the road crew was done. And he spent evenings with Margaret, eating supper at the boarding house or walking slowly along the main street, talking in low voices about things that mattered and things that did not. He's different, Margaret said to Daniel one evening. They were standing on the boardwalk outside the laundry, watching the sun set over the rooftops. Ethan was inside, helping fold sheets, his crutch propped against the wall. Different how? He talks about the future. He never did that before. Before, the future was just, she made a vague gesture, something to get through. Now he talks about what he wants to do, what he wants to learn. He talks about horses. He talks about school. He's got a good mind for school. Mamie says he picks up arithmetic faster than any child she's taught. She told me. Margaret paused. She also told me about the surgery, Richard's offer. Daniel nodded. I told Ethan it was his choice. And he chose. He said okay. He said he wants to walk without the crutch. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to feel about that. The crutch has been part of him for so long, part of our life. Getting rid of it feels like... She stopped, searching for the word. Like letting go of something that kept him safe, even if it also held him back. Safe doesn't mean good, Daniel said. He's got more in him than that crutch lets him show. I know, she looked at him. I know. They stood in the cooling evening air, two people who had been brought together by a 5-year-old boy, learning to navigate the strange, uncharted territory of a shared future. Margaret started coming to the stable in the evenings after her shift at the laundry. At first it was to collect Ethan for supper, but gradually she started staying longer, sitting at the small table while Daniel cooked, offering quiet observations about his technique. She did not criticize, but she had a way of suggesting improvements that made them seem like her own idea. "You're burning the onions again," she said one evening, with the same tone Mamie used. "I know," Daniel said, not turning around. "Have you considered using less heat?" "I've considered it." And I keep forgetting." Margaret stood and walked to the stove. She gently moved Daniel aside with her shoulder and stirred the onions herself, lowering the flame with a practiced flick of her wrist. "Like this," she said, "slow and patient. Onions don't like to be rushed." Daniel watched her work. She moved with the economy of someone who had spent years cooking on limited resources, wasting nothing, stretching everything. Her hands were thin but steady, the hands of a woman who had learned to make do. "You cook," he said. "I cooked. Before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything. "Before things fell apart. I worked in a kitchen in Tucson for 2 years. The cook taught me everything she knew. And then I got sick, lost the job. Ended up under a trestle bridge with my son." She said it flatly, without self-pity, the way people state facts that have lost their power to wound through repetition. Life doesn't always go the way you plan. "No," Daniel agreed, "it doesn't." She finished the onions and stepped back. "There, now they won't be burned." They ate together that night, Daniel, Ethan, and Margaret, at the small table in the room above the stable. The cat had found its way up the stairs and was positioned hopefully near Ethan's chair, and the lamp cast a warm glow across the simple meal. It was not fancy. It was not the kind of spread Richard Miller could have provided, but it was theirs. "You know," Margaret said, setting down her fork, "I spent years thinking I had to do everything alone, that asking for help was weakness, that depending on someone meant giving up control." Daniel looked at her across the table. "Ethan taught me different," she continued. "He taught me that letting someone in is not a weakness. It's the hardest thing in the world." She looked at her son, who was feeding a small piece of bread to the cat under the table. "And you taught him that it was safe to let someone in." "I just sat down beside him." "You did more than that." She met his eyes. "You stayed." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. It was the same word Ethan had used in the courtroom. It was the same word that had come to define everything Daniel had done since that first afternoon. "I'm not going anywhere," Daniel said. "I know," Margaret said. "That's what scares me." She did not explain what she meant, and Daniel did not ask. But as the evening wore on and Ethan's bedtime approached, they moved around each other with the careful, tentative grace of people learning a new dance, learning how to share space, share responsibility, share a child who had become the center of both their worlds. The weeks passed, and the rhythm settled into something that felt almost natural. Margaret worked at the laundry, saved every cent she could, and spent her evenings at the stable. She and Daniel developed a routine. He cooked, she cleaned, Ethan did his sums at the table and offered commentary on everything. The cat continued to appear at mealtimes with the regularity of a clock. Mamie watched it all with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen the whole thing coming. "They're going to be all right," she said to Carver one afternoon, standing at the diner window, watching Margaret and Ethan walk down the street together. "All three of them." "Reckon so," Carver said. "Takes a village to raise a child. Or in this case, a stable hand, a diner owner, and a laundry woman. And a rich uncle in Seattle," Mamie added. "And a rich uncle in Seattle." But not everything was smooth. There were moments when the weight of the past pressed down on them, moments when Margaret's eyes went distant and her hands stilled, moments when Ethan woke from nightmares that had not visited him in weeks, moments when Daniel lay awake in the dark and stared at the ceiling and wondered if he was enough. One night, 3 weeks after Margaret's arrival, Ethan woke screaming. Daniel was out of his cot and across the room before he was fully awake, the way he had done a dozen times before. He crouched beside the boy's cot, his voice low and steady. "You're here. You're in the room. You're safe." But this time, Ethan did not settle. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide and unseeing. "The bridge," he gasped. "They took her. They took her, and I couldn't find her, and I couldn't walk fast enough." "Ethan, look at me." The boy's eyes found his, but they were still full of the dream. "Your mama is at the boarding house. She's safe. She's sleeping. She's not gone." "I couldn't find her." "Look at me." Daniel's voice was firmer now, not harsh but anchored. "You found her. She came back. She's here. She's not leaving." Ethan's breathing started to slow. His hands, which had been gripping the blanket, loosened slightly. "I'm going to go get her," Daniel said. "I'm going to bring her here, and you can see her with your own eyes. Will that help?" Ethan nodded, a small, jerky motion. Daniel pulled on his boots and coat and walked through the cold night air to the boarding house. He knocked on the door, and the widow opened it, and he explained in as few words as possible. Margaret appeared a moment later, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale with concern. "Is he all right?" "He had a nightmare. He needs to see you." They walked back together, not speaking, their footsteps quick on the dark street. When they reached the stable, Margaret climbed the stairs ahead of Daniel and crossed to Ethan's cot in 3 strides. She sat down on the edge and pulled him into her arms. "I'm here," she said. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Ethan pressed his face into her shoulder and did not cry. He just held on, and Margaret held him back. And Daniel stood in the doorway and watched them and felt something in his chest that was too large to name. After a long moment, Ethan pulled back. His eyes were red, but his face was steady. "I'm sorry I woke you," he said to both of them. "Don't ever be sorry for needing someone," Margaret said. "That's what we're here for." Ethan looked at Daniel, who was still standing in the doorway. "You went and got her." "I said I would." "You always do what you say." "I try to." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you're both here." Daniel crossed the room and sat down on his own cot, across from Margaret and Ethan. "We're glad we're here too." The lamp burned low. The cat, which had somehow gotten into the room, sat on the windowsill and washed its face with the absolute unconcern of creatures who do not understand human drama. And the three of them sat together in the quiet of the night, held together by nothing more than the choice to stay. The 6-month review arrived faster than any of them expected. Judge Whitmore had scheduled it for late February, and the notice came on a cold morning when frost lay thick on the boardwalks and the breath of every living thing hung in the air like smoke. Daniel read the notice at Mamie's counter, his coffee growing cold beside him. He had been expecting it, had been preparing for it, but the sight of the official paper still sent a tightness through his chest. "It's just a review," Mamie said, reading over his shoulder. "He already ruled in your favor. This is just a check-in." 6 months is a long time. A lot can change. "Nothing's changed that matters." She tapped the paper with her finger. "You've still got the same room, the same job, the same boy waiting for you at the back table." Daniel looked at the back table, where Ethan was frowning over a long division problem, his pencil moving in small, careful strokes. Margaret was at work at the laundry, but she would join them for supper tonight, as she did most nights. "Nothing's changed," Daniel repeated. "That's what worries me." "What worries you?" "The review asks about housing, employment, the child's welfare. Those are all fine. But it also asks about the child's mother. Margaret's been working, she's been saving, she's been getting stronger. What if the judge decides she's fit now? What if he gives custody back to her?" Mamie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would that be so bad?" Daniel looked at her. "What?" "Her being fit, her taking her son back. You've been holding that boy like he's yours, but he's not yours, Daniel. He's hers." The words hit harder than they should have. Daniel set down the paper and stared at the wall for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I know he's hers. I never forgot that." "Then what are you afraid of?" He was quiet for so long that Mamie started to turn away. Then he said, his voice low, "I'm afraid of losing him." "Not to her, I don't mean that. I'm afraid of waking up one day and he's gone, and I'm back to being alone in that room above the stable, and none of this ever happened." Mamie looked at him with the steady, unflinching gaze of a woman who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "You won't lose him," she said. "Even if he goes to live with her, you won't lose him. That boy has tied himself to you in ways that don't come untied. You gave him something he never had before. He's not going to forget that." "I hope you're right." "I'm always right." She picked up his cold coffee and poured it out, refilling the cup with fresh. "Drink this. You've got a review to prepare for." The hearing was brief, far briefer than the first one. Judge Whitmore had aged slightly in the intervening months, or perhaps it was just the winter light that made him look more tired. He reviewed the reports from Daniel's employer, from Mamie, from Carver, from the doctor who had examined Ethan in the fall. He noted that Ethan's weight had increased, that his education was progressing, that he had received regular meals and consistent care. Then he asked about Margaret. Daniel had not consulted her beforehand. He had not asked her to say anything specific. He had simply told her what the review would ask, and she had nodded and said nothing. Now she stood before the judge. In a dress she had mended herself, her hands clasped in front of her, and she spoke in a voice that was steady and quiet. "Your Honor, I spent years trying to survive. I did not do a good job of it. My son paid the price for my failures." She paused. "I am not the same woman I was 6 months ago. I have work. I have a place to stay. I am getting stronger every day. But I am not yet in a position to provide for my son the way he deserves." She looked at Daniel, then back at the judge. "Mr. Brooks has given my son something I could not give him: stability, safety, a future. I am not asking to take that away from him." She took a breath. "I am asking that the current arrangement continue, with the understanding that I will be a part of my son's life, and that I will continue to work toward the day when I can provide for him myself." Judge Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Daniel, who sat at his table with Reardon beside him, his hands flat on the wood. "Mr. Brooks," the judge said, "do you have anything to add?" Daniel stood. He had not prepared a speech. He had not prepared anything. He simply spoke the truth, the way it came to him. "Your Honor, I never set out to be this boy's guardian. I set out to give him breakfast. But somewhere along the way, he became more than just a boy I was looking after. He became—" He stopped, searching for the word. "He became family." He looked at Margaret, who was watching him with an expression he could not read. "I have no claim to him that outweighs hers. She is his mother. That is not something I can replace, and I would not want to. But I would like to remain in his life, in whatever capacity that takes." Judge Whitmore pulled his beard once, the same gesture he had made 6 months ago. Then he looked at Ethan, who was sitting in the front row between Mamie and Carver. "Ethan," he said, "you've been quiet. Do you have anything you want to say?" Ethan stood up, using his crutch for balance. He had grown in the past 6 months, and the crutch looked smaller against him than it had before. He faced the judge with the same steady gaze he had worn in that same room half a year ago. "I want to stay with Daniel," he said, "and I want my mama to be there too. I want us to be together, all of us." He paused. "Daniel taught me that there's enough room for everyone. I think he's right." Whitmore looked at the three of them, the man, the woman, the child, and something in his face softened, just slightly. "I think he's right too," the judge said. "Temporary custody remains with Daniel Brooks, with the understanding that Margaret Miller will have regular visitation and will be involved in all major decisions regarding the child's welfare. This arrangement will be reviewed again in 1 year, at which time the court will consider whether changes are warranted." He closed his papers. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down, and Daniel felt something release in his chest that he had been holding since the moment he first saw the review notice. They walked out of the town hall together, Daniel, Margaret, and Ethan, into the cold February air. The sky was pale and clear, and the sun was bright despite the chill. Ethan was between them, his crutch tapping on the frozen ground. "That went well?" Margaret said. "It did. I meant what I said in there." "I'm not trying to take him away." "I know. And I meant what I said too," Ethan added. "I want both of you." Daniel looked at Margaret over the top of Ethan's head. She looked back at him, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Something that looked like trust. "Then both of us you shall have," Daniel said. They walked down the street together, the three of them, and behind them the town hall doors swung shut on the past, and ahead of them the spring was waiting. The winter months passed slowly over Harlan's Crossing, each week carrying them closer to the spring that would bring Ethan's surgery. The cold settled into the bones of the town, frost glazing the boardwalks each morning, the breath of horses and men alike hanging in the air like ghosts. Daniel worked the road crew through the chill, his hands cracking and bleeding despite the rags he wrapped around them. He saved every cent he could, though Richard had already made it clear the surgery was fully funded. It was not about the money anymore. It was about being ready, being prepared, being the kind of man who showed up with his part of the bargain fulfilled. Margaret continued at the laundry, her strength returning slowly, her hands growing steadier. She had moved from the boarding house to a small room above the milliner's shop, a cramped space with a single window and a stove that smoked when the wind blew wrong. But it was hers, paid for with her own wages, and she looked at it each night with a quiet pride that Daniel recognized because he felt it too about his own room above the stable. They had fallen into a pattern that none of them had named, but all of them understood. Evenings were spent together, most nights at the stable room, sometimes at Mamie's, occasionally at Margaret's small room when the stove was behaving. The cat had adopted all 3 locations as its territory and moved between them with the regal indifference of a creature that knew exactly how loved it was. Ethan had grown. Not just in height, though he had put on 2 inches since the summer, but in something less visible. The guarded watchfulness was still there, but it had softened into something more like thoughtfulness. He no longer checked the cupboard before each meal to confirm there was food. He no longer saved half his dinner for the next day. He had begun to believe, in the deep places where belief matters most, that the scarcity was over. The surgery was scheduled for the second week of April. The San Francisco surgeon would travel to Tucson, where a room had been arranged at the county hospital. Richard Miller had coordinated everything, sending letters and wires with the efficiency of a man who was used to making things happen. He arrived in Harlan's Crossing 3 days before they were to leave, stepping off the stage with a leather satchel and a new hat, and an expression that was more subdued than it had been on his first visit. He found Daniel at the stable, mending a halter in the late afternoon light. "Brooks," he said. "Miller." They had moved past formality into something that was not quite friendship, but was closer than either of them had expected. Richard set his satchel on a barrel and leaned against the stable wall. "The surgeon confirmed the schedule. We leave day after tomorrow. The procedure will take most of the morning, and he'll need to stay in Tucson for at least 2 weeks for the initial recovery." Daniel nodded, not looking up from his work. "I've arranged time off from the crew. Carver said he'd look after the room while we're gone. Margaret is coming?" "She is." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Good. He'll need both of you." Daniel set down the halter and looked at Richard. "What are you not telling me?" Richard's pause was barely perceptible, but Daniel caught it. "The surgeon is confident. But it's a complicated procedure. There are risks." "What kind of risks?" "Infection, complications from the bone work, the possibility that the correction won't take as fully as hoped." Richard met his eyes. "I'm not telling you this to worry you. I'm telling you because I think you should know the truth before we go in." Daniel picked up the halter again, ran his thumb along a seam. "Does Ethan know?" "He knows there are risks. I told him the same thing I just told you." "And how did he take it?" Richard almost smiled. "He asked if the surgeon had ever done this before. I told him yes, many times. He asked how many. I told him over 100. He said that was good enough for him." Daniel felt something move in his chest. Pride, maybe, or the particular ache of watching someone small face something big with more courage than they should have to muster. "He's braver than most men I know." "He's braver than most men I know too," Richard said. "And he learned it from somewhere, not from me." The night before they left, the three of them sat in the room above the stable, Daniel, Margaret, and Ethan, sharing a supper that Mamie had prepared and sent up with strict instructions about how to reheat it. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. The cat had positioned itself on Ethan's cot, having decided that the boy's absence would begin tonight, and it needed to stake its claim early. Ethan ate slowly, his crutch leaning against the table beside him. He had been quiet all evening, not sullen but thoughtful, the way he got when he was processing something large. "You nervous?" Margaret asked, setting down her fork. Ethan considered the question seriously. "A little." "That's all right. I'm nervous too." "You are?" "I am." She reached across the table and took his hand. "But I'm also hopeful, and I'm proud of you for doing this." Ethan looked at her hand on his, then at Daniel. "Are you nervous?" Daniel set down his coffee. "I'm nervous for you. Not of the surgery itself. The surgeon knows what he's doing. But I'm nervous about you being in pain, about you being scared, about not being able to fix it for you." Ethan absorbed this. "You can't fix everything." "No, I can't. But you stay anyway." "Every time." Ethan nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. He finished his supper, pushed his plate away, and looked at both of them. "I want to say something." They waited. "When I wake up after the surgery, I might not be able to walk for a while. The doctor said I'll have to learn again. Like a baby." He paused. "I don't want either of you to feel sorry for me. I'm doing this because I want to, and I know it's going to be hard. But I want you to treat me the same as always. Don't act like I'm broken." Margaret's eyes were bright, but she did not cry. "We won't." "Daniel, you'll still make me do my sums?" "Every day." "And Mama, you'll still make me eat my vegetables?" "Every meal." Ethan looked at them both, and for just a moment, the careful mask slipped, and he looked exactly like what he was, a small boy about to face something terrifying, holding himself together by force of will. "Good," he said. "Then I'm ready." They left at dawn. Carver drove them to the stage in his wagon, the morning air cold and still, the stars still visible in the paling sky. Mamie had pressed a sack of food into Margaret's hands, biscuits, dried meat, a jar of preserves, with the same fierce efficiency she applied to everything. Marshal Hicks had come to see them off, standing on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands. "Send word when it's done," Hicks said. "I will," Daniel said, "and bring him back safe." "That's the plan." The stage ride to Tucson took the better part of a day, stopping at way stations to change horses and let passengers stretch their legs. Ethan sat by the window, his crutch wedged between his knees, watching the landscape roll past. The endless stretches of desert, the distant mountains still capped with snow, the occasional cluster of buildings that marked a town too small to have a name. He did not speak much, but his hand rested on the seat beside him, and Daniel kept his own hand close enough that the boy could reach it if he needed. Margaret sat across from them, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on her son. She had the look of a woman who was holding herself together by will alone, the same look Daniel had seen on his own face in the mirror 100 times. They arrived in Tucson as the sun was setting, the city spreading out before them in a haze of dust and lamplight. It was larger than Harlan's Crossing, larger than anything Ethan had ever seen, and he pressed his face to the window, taking in the two-story buildings, the crowded streets, the sheer press of people moving in every direction. "It's big," he said. "It is," Daniel agreed. "Are there really this many people everywhere?" "Every day." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I think I like Harlan's Crossing better." Daniel felt something warm spread through his chest. "Me too." Richard met them at the stage depot, having arrived the day before to finalize the arrangements. He led them through the evening streets to a boarding house near the hospital, a clean, quiet place run by a woman who had been warned to expect them. She showed them to their rooms, one for Daniel and Ethan, one for Margaret, one for Richard, and told them supper would be served in an hour. That night, after supper, Daniel sat on the edge of Ethan's cot in their shared room. The boy was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, his hands folded on his chest. "Daniel," he said. "Yeah, what if it doesn't work?" The question hung in the dim light. Daniel had been expecting it, had been bracing for it, but the sound of it in Ethan's voice, steady and honest and scared, still hit him like a blow. "Then we try something else," Daniel said. "Or we learn to live with what we've got. But either way, you're still you. Your leg doesn't change who you are. It changes how people see me. People see what they want to see. The ones who matter see you." Ethan turned his head to look at him. "Like you?" "Like me. Like your mama. Like Mamie and Carver and your Uncle Richard." He paused. "And like that cat, who's probably asleep on your cot right now, waiting for you to come back." Ethan almost smiled. "He's going to be mad when he finds out I left. He'll forgive you. Cats are good at that." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you're here." "Me too." He did not say he was scared. He did not need to. Daniel stayed on the edge of the cot until the boy's breathing evened out into sleep, and then he sat in the dark for a long time, watching over him. The surgery was scheduled for 8 in the morning. They arrived at the hospital as the sun was rising, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold that seemed too beautiful for a day that held such fear. The surgeon met them at the door, a man named Dr. Alden, gray-haired and calm, with hands that were steady and eyes that had seen too much to be rattled by anything. He spoke to Ethan directly, which Daniel noted with approval. "I'm going to explain exactly what's going to happen," Alden said, crouching to Ethan's level. "I'm going to give you medicine that will make you sleep. While you're sleeping, I'm going to work on your leg. It will take a few hours. When you wake up, you'll be in a different room, and your leg will feel different. It might hurt, but I will give you medicine for the pain, and your family will be there when you open your eyes." Ethan listened carefully. "Will I be able to walk right away?" "No. You'll need to rest for several days. Then you'll start learning to walk again, with help. Will it be hard?" "Yes. But you can do hard things." Ethan looked at him for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because you're here. You came all this way. You chose to do this. That's already the hardest part." Ethan seemed to accept this. He looked at Daniel, then at Margaret, then back at the surgeon. "Okay," he said. "I'm ready." They took him away, and the waiting began. The hours passed like days. Daniel and Margaret sat in a small room with wooden chairs and a single window that looked out onto a courtyard where a dry fountain stood empty. Richard was there too, sitting apart, his hands clasped between his knees. None of them spoke much. There was nothing to say that had not already been said. At noon, a nurse brought them tea that none of them drank. At 1, a different nurse came to tell them that the surgery was progressing well. At 2:30, Dr. Alden appeared in the doorway, his surgical apron still tied, his face tired but calm. "It went well," he said. "The correction was more extensive than we anticipated, but we achieved what we set out to do. He's in recovery now. You can see him in about an hour." Margaret let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since morning. Richard leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Daniel sat very still, his hands flat on his knees, and let the relief wash through him like water. "He's going to be all right?" Daniel asked. "He's going to be in significant pain for the next few days. The recovery will be long, but yes, he's going to be all right." Dr. Alden paused. "He asked about you before he went under. He wanted me to tell you that he wasn't scared and that he'd see you soon." Daniel did not trust himself to speak. He nodded. They were allowed into the recovery room an hour later. Ethan was propped on pillows, his leg wrapped in bandages from hip to ankle, his face pale against the white sheets. He was awake, but his eyes were heavy, still clouded with the remnants of the anesthesia. "Hey, bud," Daniel said softly, taking the chair beside the bed. Ethan's eyes found him. "It hurts," he said. His voice was thin. "I know. The doctor said it would. But it's going to be better?" "It's going to be better." Ethan nodded, a tiny motion. Then he looked past Daniel to where Margaret stood, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Mama." She crossed to the other side of the bed and took his hand. "I'm here. Don't cry." "I'm not crying." She was crying. "It's okay," Ethan said. "I'm okay." And lying there wrapped in bandages, pale and weak, and in more pain than he had ever known, he was comforting her. Daniel watched it happen, watched the boy reach out with his small, steady courage and pull his mother back from the edge of her own fear. And he understood that this child was made of something rare and unbreakable. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest Daniel had ever lived through. The first 3 days were a blur of pain and medicine and fever. When Ethan barely woke, and when he did, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, grinding endurance of someone who had learned long ago that no one was coming to save him. Daniel sat by his bed through all of it, holding his hand, wiping his forehead, speaking in the low, steady voice that had become the anchor of the boy's world. Margaret stayed too, taking shifts with Daniel, sleeping in the chair beside the bed when she could not bear to leave. Richard came and went, handling the paperwork, the payments, the endless logistics that made the whole thing possible. Mamie sent a letter every other day, short and practical, full of news about the cat and the weather and the price of cornmeal. On the 4th day, Ethan woke with clearer eyes. The fever had broken. The pain was still there, but it was manageable now, a dull throb instead of a sharp edge. He looked at Daniel and said, "I'm hungry." Daniel had never been so glad to hear anyone ask for food. They started the slow work of recovery. Physical therapy began on the 6th day. Gentle movements, small exercises, the careful bending of joints that had been locked in place for years. Ethan hated it. He did it anyway, because Ethan Miller did not know how to quit. "Again," the therapist said, and Ethan would grit his teeth and move his leg another inch. Again, and he would do it. Again, and he would do it, his face white with effort, his hands gripping the sides of the bed. Daniel watched from the doorway and did not let himself feel the full weight of what he was seeing, because if he did, he would not be able to stand. Margaret wrote to Mamie every few days, updates on Ethan's progress. She wrote in a neat, careful hand, and her letters were full of details. The angle of the bandages, the number of exercises completed, the exact shade of the bruising. She did not write about how she felt, but Mamie read between the lines anyway. On the 10th day, Ethan took his first step. It was not a real step, not the kind that would carry him across a room. It was a small, tentative shift of weight from his good leg to the healing one, supported by a metal frame the therapist had brought in. He held onto the frame with both hands, his knuckles white, his face tight with concentration. "Ready?" the therapist asked. Ethan nodded. He shifted his weight. The leg held. He took one small, shuffling step forward. It was not beautiful. It was not graceful. It was a child learning to walk for the second time, and it was the most beautiful thing Daniel had ever seen. "Good," the therapist said. "Again." Ethan looked up, and for just a moment his eyes met Daniel's, standing in the doorway. There was pain in them, and effort, and the fierce, unbreakable will that had carried him through 4 days alone beside a broken hitching post. "I did it," he said. "You did it," Daniel said. "I'm going to do it again. I know you are." The second week passed, and Ethan grew stronger. The bandages came down, replaced by a lighter brace. The crutch was still necessary, but it was no longer the central fact of his existence. It was a tool now, not a sentence. He could stand without support for a few seconds at a time. He could take 3 steps, then 5, then 10. The day before they were to return to Harlan's Crossing, Dr. Alden came to examine him. He manipulated the leg, checked the alignment, nodded to himself. "He's healing well," the doctor said. "He'll need to continue the exercises. He'll need to be patient. But I expect he'll be walking without the crutch within 6 months." "Without the crutch," Ethan repeated, as if tasting the words. "Not all the time, but for short distances, everyday things." Ethan looked at his crutch, leaning against the wall. He touched it, ran his hand along the worn wood. Then he looked at Daniel. "I think I'll keep it," he said, "for a while, just in case." "Whatever you need," Daniel said. "It reminds me," Ethan paused. "It reminds me where I was, so I don't forget." "Forget what?" Daniel almost asked. But he did not. He knew. The crutch reminded Ethan that he had been alone, and that someone had stopped. It reminded him that the world could be cruel, but it could also be kind. It reminded him that he had survived. They returned to Harlan's Crossing on a cool April evening, the stage pulling in as the sun was setting. The whole town seemed to be waiting. Mamie on the boardwalk, Carver at the stable, Marshall Hicks leaning against the hitching post. Even Ben Pruitt was there, standing at the edge of the crowd with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Ethan stepped down from the stage on his crutch, his leg brace visible beneath his trousers. He looked at the familiar street, the familiar faces, the familiar dust. "I'm home," he said. Mamie crossed the distance and pulled him into an embrace that was fiercer than anyone expected from a woman of her size and age. "You scared the life out of me," she said into his hair. "I'm fine," Ethan said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "You better be. I need help with the cornbread." They walked through the crowd together, Daniel and Margaret and Ethan, receiving nods and words of welcome. People who had looked away from the cripple boy 6 months ago now reached out to touch his shoulder, to tell him they were glad he was back. The town had changed. Or maybe the boy had changed the town. That night they sat in the room above the stable, Daniel, Margaret, and Ethan, with the cat on the windowsill and the lamp burning low. The crutch was propped in the corner, but Ethan had walked from the door to the table without it, using furniture for support. It had taken him 3 minutes. He had not complained. "Tomorrow," Ethan said, "I want to see the horses." "Carver will be glad to have you back," Daniel said. "And I want to start my sums again. I'm behind." "You're not behind. You had surgery." "I'm behind." Ethan said it firmly, the way he said everything that mattered. "I want to catch up." Margaret smiled, the first real smile Daniel had seen on her face in weeks. "You sound like your father." The words hung in the air. Ethan went still. Daniel looked at Margaret. "I never told you about him," Margaret said quietly. "Your father, he was like that, stubborn, determined. He never let anything stop him." "What happened to him?" Ethan asked. "He died, before you were born." "A fever took him," she paused. "But he would have been proud of you. He would have been so proud." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I wish I could have known him." "Me too." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. They sat together in the lamplight, the 3 of them, bound by loss and hope, and the stubborn refusal to give up. And Daniel watched them, the woman who had walked from a hospital bed to find her son, the boy who had learned to trust again, and he thought about the strange, winding path that had brought them all to this room. There was a letter waiting for Margaret at the boarding house the next morning. It was from the widow who ran the laundry in Tucson, offering her a position as head laundress, with a small room attached and a wage that was more than she was making now. It was a good opportunity, a chance to build something stable, something real. Margaret read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in her pocket. She did not mention it to anyone. Not that day. Not the next. But Daniel saw her touch her pocket when she thought no one was watching, and he knew that something was coming. He just did not know yet how much it would change everything. Margaret carried the letter from Tucson in her apron pocket for 3 full days before she showed it to anyone. She read it each night by the dim light of her room above the milliner's shop, tracing the words with her finger, weighing the promise of stability against the cost of leaving. The widow who ran the laundry had offered her the position of head laundress, with a private room and a wage that would allow her to save, to plan, to finally build something that was hers, alone. It was everything she had been working toward since she stepped off that stage in October. It was a chance to stand on her own feet and provide for her son the way she had always wanted to. But it was in Tucson. 3 days' ride from Harlan's Crossing, from Daniel, from the room above the stable where Ethan had learned to trust again. On the 4th day, she walked to the stable in the late afternoon and found Daniel alone, mending a harness in the yard. The spring air was warm and carried the smell of horses and hay and the first green growth of the season. She sat down on an overturned bucket and watched him work for a long moment before she spoke. "I got a letter," she said, "from Tucson. The widow who runs the laundry offered me a position, head laundress, with a room." Daniel's hands paused on the harness. He did not look up. "That's a good opportunity." "It is. What are you going to do?" She had been asking herself that question for 3 days. She had not found an answer that felt right. "I don't know." Daniel set down the harness and looked at her. His face was steady, the way it always was, but there was something in his eyes that she had learned to read over the past months. A carefulness, a holding back. "It's your choice," he said. "Whatever you decide, we'll make it work." "We?" "You and Ethan, and me if you want me to be part of that." He paused. "I know I don't have a claim on you. I know we haven't talked about what this is, what we are. But I'm telling you now, Margaret, that I want to be part of it, whatever it looks like." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows across the yard. A horse stamped in the stable. Somewhere in town a dog barked, the ordinary sound of ordinary life. "You're asking me to stay," she said. "I'm asking you to choose what you want, not what you think you should want. Not what's safe, what you actually want." She thought about the room in Tucson, clean and private and hers alone. She thought about the wages, the security, the independence. She thought about waking up alone each morning, eating supper alone each night, watching her son grow up from a distance, visiting him on holidays like a stranger. She thought about the room above the stable, the small table where they ate together, the cat that appeared at every meal, the way Ethan laughed now, freely and often, the way Daniel looked at her when he thought she was not watching. "I want to stay," she said. The words came out quiet, but they were the truest thing she had said in years. "I want to stay here, with you, with Ethan. I want us to be a family." Daniel did not move. He sat very still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on hers. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He stood up slowly, crossed the space between them, and sat down on the ground beside her bucket. He did not touch her. He just sat there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling air. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. Together. Ethan found them like that when he came down from the room, his crutch tapping on the stairs, his leg brace clicking with each step. He stopped at the bottom and looked at them, his mother on the bucket, Daniel on the ground beside her, both of them sitting in the golden light of the setting sun. "What happened?" he asked. "Your mama got a job offer in Tucson," Daniel said. Ethan's face went still. "Are we leaving?" "No," Margaret said. "I turned it down." "You did?" "I did. Because I want to be here, with both of you." Ethan stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the yard, his crutch moving with the rhythm that had become as familiar to them as breathing, and he sat down on the ground on Daniel's other side. The three of them sat together in the dust of the stable yard, watching the sun sink below the roofline of Carver's stable. "Good," Ethan said. "I didn't want to leave anyway." The news spread through Harlan's Crossing the way news always spread, fast and with embellishments. By the next morning, Mamie knew, and Carver knew, and Marshall Hicks knew, and even Ben Pruitt had heard a version of it by noon. Margaret Miller had turned down a job in Tucson to stay in Harlan's Crossing, and she was living in the room above the stable with Daniel Brooks and her son, and everyone understood what that meant without anyone having to say it out loud. Ben Pruitt came to the stable that evening. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking older than he had 6 months ago. The certainty that had once defined him, worn thin by time, and the quiet judgment of a town that had watched him try to take a child away from a man who had only ever tried to help. "Brooks," he said. "Pruitt, I came to say something." He paused, swallowed. "I was wrong. About you, about the boy, about everything." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel said nothing. "I had no right to do what I did," Pruitt continued. "I told myself I was looking out for the town, for the child, but I was looking out for my own pride. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. He thought about all the ways Pruitt had made things harder. The whispers, the record he had provided to the lawyers, the way he had stood up in the town hall to try to take Ethan away. He thought about the weight of holding on to anger, and how heavy it was. "Apology accepted," Daniel said. Pruitt blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that. Holding a grudge ain't going to feed anyone, and I've got better things to do with my time." Pruitt stood there for a moment, as if waiting for the punchline. When it did not come, he put his hat back on and nodded once. "You're a better man than me, Brooks. I'm not better than anyone. I just learned when to stop." Pruitt walked away, and Daniel watched him go, and he felt something lift from his shoulders that he had not known was there. The spring deepened into the fullness of May. The days grew long and warm, the cottonwoods leafed out along the main street, and the dust of Harlan's Crossing settled into the familiar rhythm of small-town life. Ethan's recovery continued steadily, each day bringing a small improvement, an extra step without the crutch, a little more weight on the healing leg, a little less dependence on the brace that held everything in place. He practiced every evening in the stable yard, walking between Daniel and Margaret, his hands outstretched, his face tight with concentration. He fell often, and each time he got up without complaint, dusted himself off, and tried again. "I'm going to get this," he said one evening, after a fall that had left him sprawled in the dirt. "I don't care how long it takes." "I know you will," Daniel said, helping him up. "I'm going to run, all the way to Mamie's and back." "Then you better keep practicing." The night before Mamie's birthday, she announced that she was closing the diner for the day and that everyone was invited to a celebration at her place. It was not a request, it was a command. And the people of Harlan's Crossing, who knew better than to argue with Mamie Coulthard, showed up with pies and preserves and jars of pickled vegetables, and all the things that people bring when they want to say thank you without saying it directly. The celebration spilled out of Mamie's small house and into the yard, where lanterns had been strung between the trees. Carver had brought his fiddle, and Marshall Hicks had brought a jug of something that was not quite legal, and by the time the stars came out, the whole town was gathered in Mamie's yard, eating and laughing and talking in the warm spring night. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, leaning on his crutch, watching. He had been walking more without it, but tonight he had chosen to keep it. It was familiar. It was safe. It reminded him of where he had been. Margaret came up beside him. "You all right?" "I'm fine, just watching." "It's a lot of people." "It's a lot of people who came to see Mamie," he paused. "And us, maybe." Margaret looked at the crowd. People she had barely spoken to when she first arrived were now nodding at her, smiling, raising their cups in her direction. The town had opened its doors, slowly, cautiously, but truly. "I think you're right," she said. Daniel appeared on Ethan's other side. "Mamie wants to make a speech." "Since when does Mamie make speeches?" Ethan asked. "Since tonight, apparently. She's been drinking Carver's jug." They watched as Mamie climbed onto a stump in the middle of the yard, her face flushed, her apron still on because she had refused to take it off even for her own party. She raised her hands for silence, and the crowd quieted. "I'm not going to talk long," she said. "I know you're all here for the pie." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I wanted to say something before I get too old to remember it." She looked out at the faces turned toward her. "A year ago, a man walked into my diner with a boy he had found sitting alone in the street. He had nothing. No money, no family, no reason to take that child in, except that he couldn't walk past him." She paused. "That boy changed this town. He reminded us what it means to stop. He reminded us that the measure of a person is not what they have, but what they give away." She looked at Ethan, and her voice thickened. "And that man, that broken-down road worker with nothing but a room above a stable and a heart full of guilt, showed us all what it means to be a father." Daniel felt his throat close. He looked at the ground. "To Daniel and Margaret and Ethan," Mamie said, raising her cup. "To the family that started with a biscuit." "To the family," the crowd repeated. Ethan looked up at Daniel. "She called me family," he said. "You are family, and you're my father." The words were simple, spoken quietly, almost lost in the noise of the crowd. But Daniel heard them. He heard them with every part of himself. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice rough. Ethan nodded, once, sharp and precise. Then he turned back to watch the crowd, but his hand found Daniel's and held on. Later that night, when the lanterns had burned low and the last guests had gone home, the three of them walked back to the stable together. The moon was full, casting silver light across the empty street. Ethan walked between them, his crutch tapping on the boardwalk, the brace clicking with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, he stopped. "Can I try something?" he asked. "What?" Margaret said. He leaned his crutch against the wall. Then, carefully, he took one step without it. Then another. Then another. His leg trembled, his face was tight with effort. But he kept going, across the yard, past the water trough, to the fence that bordered Carver's pasture. He reached the fence and put his hand on it to steady himself. Then, he turned around and looked back at them, standing at the bottom of the stairs. "I did it," he said. Daniel walked toward him slowly, not wanting to break the spell. "You did it. Without the crutch. All the way across." Ethan looked down at his leg. The brace was still there, the scar still fresh, the muscles still weak. But he had walked. He had walked on his own. "Next time," he said, "I'm going to run." "I don't doubt it." They stood together at the fence, looking out at the moonlit pasture, the horses moving like shadows in the dark. Margaret joined them, and the three of them stood in a row, the way they had sat in the dust of the stable yard, the way they had sat in the diner on that first afternoon. "I have something to say," Daniel said, "and I want to say it while we're all standing here." They looked at him. "I never thought I would have a family again," he said. "After Clara, I thought I had used up my chance. I thought I was too broken to be trusted with anyone else's happiness." He paused. "But you two showed me different. You showed me that broken things can be mended, that love is not something you earn, it's something you choose." He looked at Margaret. "I choose you. I choose both of you, for as long as you'll have me." Margaret did not speak. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and she held him the way she had held Ethan on the day she returned, fiercely, completely, with all the gratitude and hope that she had been carrying for months. Ethan watched them for a moment. Then he said, "Does this mean we're a real family now?" Daniel looked at Margaret. She looked at him. They looked at Ethan, standing in the moonlight, his brace glinting, his face full of the cautious hope of a child who had learned to believe again. "Ethan," Daniel said, "we've been a real family since the day I sat down beside you in the dirt. We just needed time to catch up to it." Ethan considered this. Then he nodded, the way he always did when he had accepted something as true. "Good," he said, "because I'm not going anywhere." He looked at the crutch leaning against the stairs, then at the fence he had walked to on his own. He looked at the room above the stable where he had learned to trust again, and at the diner where he had learned to do his sums, and at the woman who had walked from Tucson to find him, and at the man who had stopped when everyone else walked past. "I want to show you something," he said. He walked back to the stairs, carefully, without the crutch, his leg trembling but holding. He picked up the crutch and carried it to the woodpile behind the stable. He stood there for a moment, looking at it in his hands. Then he set it down, not in the woodpile, not in the trash. He laid it gently against the wall, where it could be found if ever it was needed again, but where he did not have to carry it anymore. "That's where it stays," he said, "for now, in case someone else needs it." Daniel felt something break open inside him. He looked at the crutch leaning against the wall, and he thought about the first time he had seen it, dragging through the dust of Harlan's Crossing beside a 5-year-old boy who had learned not to ask for help. "Ethan," he said, and his voice cracked. The boy turned and looked at him. "I'm proud of you." "I know," Ethan said. "You've always been proud of me, even when I didn't do anything to be proud of. You've always had plenty to be proud of. You just didn't know it." Ethan walked back to them, slower now, the effort of the night catching up with him. He stopped in front of Daniel and looked up. "I know it now," he said. They climbed the stairs together, Ethan leaning on Daniel's arm, Margaret behind them with her hand on Ethan's shoulder. The lamp was lit, the cat was on the cot, and the room above Carver's stable was warm and safe and full of the sound of people who had found each other. The months that followed were not perfect. There were still hard days, days when Ethan's leg ached and he could not walk as far as he wanted, days when Margaret's past rose up in her memory and left her quiet and distant, days when Daniel lay awake in the dark and wondered if he was enough. But those days came less often, and when they came, they faced them together. By the time the second summer arrived, Ethan was walking without the crutch for most of the day. He still kept it by the door, a reminder of where he had been, but he rarely used it. He ran across the stable yard to greet Carver's horses, and he climbed the stairs to the room 2 at a time. And he stood at the fence and looked out at the horizon with the steady, patient gaze of a boy who had learned that the world was full of things worth waiting for. Margaret had found work at the dry goods store, now run by a new owner who had bought out Ben Pruitt when he decided to move to Phoenix. She had a steady wage and a place in the community, and she walked through the streets of Harlan's Crossing with her head held high, a woman who had survived the worst and come out the other side. Richard Miller visited twice a year, bringing gifts from Seattle and taking long walks with Ethan along the creek behind the livery. He never tried to take the boy away. He had understood, finally, that family was not about ownership. It was about presence. And Daniel Brooks, the man who had started it all with a single biscuit and a willingness to sit down in the dirt, went to work each morning and came home each evening to the room above the stable where a boy and a woman were waiting for him. He cooked supper, burning the onions less often now, and they ate together at the small table with the cat under Ethan's chair and the lamp casting its warm glow across their faces. One evening in late July, on the anniversary of the day he had first turned around on the main street of Harlan's Crossing, Daniel walked to the broken hitching post outside Dunner's Feed and Seed. He stood there for a long time, looking at the spot where he had first seen Ethan, the dust and the silence, and the small boy with the cracked lips and the careful eyes. Ethan found him there. "I thought you might be here," the boy said. He was walking without the crutch, his brace hidden beneath his trousers, his gait nearly steady. "I was just remembering." "Me too." Ethan stood beside him and looked at the hitching post. "I was so scared that day." "I know. I thought I was going to die there." "I know that too." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you stopped." "I'm glad I stopped too." They stood together in the failing light, the man and the boy who had found each other in the dust of a small town in the Arizona Territory. And Daniel thought about all the things that had to go wrong for this one thing to go right. The marshal sweep, the hospital bed in Tucson, the newspaper that had reached Seattle, the uncle who had come to take a child away and stayed to become part of the family. He thought about the long, winding road that had brought them all to this moment, standing beside a broken hitching post on a summer evening, whole. "Daniel," Ethan said. "Yeah. You know what I want to be when I grow up?" "What?" "I want to be someone who stops." Daniel looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means when I see someone who needs help, I want to be the one who stops. I want to be the one who sits down in the dirt. I want to be like you." Daniel did not trust himself to speak. He put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, the way he had done 100 times before, and they stood together in the quiet of the evening, the dust settling around them, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. And if anyone had been watching from the boardwalk of Harlan's Crossing, they would have seen a man and a boy standing beside a broken hitching post, not waiting for anything, not needing anything, just standing together because that was where they belonged. The frontier was not a place. It was not a line on a map or a stretch of untamed land. The frontier was the space between who you had been and who you were becoming. It was the moment when you decided to stop walking past. It was the choice to sit down in the dirt beside someone who needed you to stay. And on that summer evening in the Arizona Territory, a man who had lost everything and a boy who had found nothing stood together in the dust of a small town, and they were not lost anymore. They were home. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.